Welcome to Ethics and Jurisprudence for Mississippi Physical Therapists and Physical Therapist Assistants. Foundations, Standards, and Contemporary Practice. Physical therapy in Mississippi sits at the intersection of clinical expertise, ethical responsibility, and state-specific legal requirements. Every clinical encounter, from the initial evaluation all the way through to discharge, is shaped not only by the practitioner's own knowledge and judgment, but also by a framework of ethical principles, professional standards, and regulatory mandates that together define the boundaries of competent and lawful practice. Understanding that framework isn't simply a licensure requirement. It's foundational to the trust that patients, employers, and the public place in physical therapists and physical therapist assistants. Mississippi requires all licensed physical therapists and physical therapist assistants to complete 30 continuing competence units during each biennial licensure period, with at least 3 hours devoted to ethics, professionalism, or jurisprudence. This course is built to satisfy that 3-hour requirement, giving you a thorough look at the ethical foundations, the professional standards, and the Mississippi-specific legal provisions that govern physical therapy practice in the state. The content brings together the 3 core ethical theories, deontological, teleological, and virtue ethics, with the 6 bioethical principles recognized by the American Physical Therapy Association, and with the profession's newly unified 2026 Code of Ethics for the physical therapy profession. The 2026 APTA Code marks a turning point in the profession's ethical evolution. For the first time in the profession's history, it combines the former separate Code of Ethics for the physical therapist and the Standards of Ethical Conduct for the physical therapist assistant into a single document. Mississippi's regulatory framework raises the stakes of that change even higher. Through Rule 3.4's incorporation by reference mechanism, the current APTA Code of Ethics carries the force of Mississippi law, and a failure to adhere to recognized professional ethical standards is an independent ground for disciplinary action by the Mississippi State Board of Physical Therapy under Rule 6.1, paragraph 19. We'll look closely at Mississippi's distinctive regulatory provisions. They include the credential-gated direct access framework, the enforceable 30-day mandatory referral rule, the 4 PTA supervision ceiling, the dry needling competency requirements, and the state's designation of physical therapists as mandatory reporters under multiple statutory mandates. The Realm Individual Process Situation model of ethical decision-making gives you a structured way to analyze these issues, and you'll apply it throughout the course. 6 clinical case studies ground these principles in realistic Mississippi practice scenarios, asking you to pull together ethical theory, APTA standards, and state law. Contemporary challenges, including telehealth compliance, artificial intelligence ethics, documentation integrity, and health equity, are examined through both the APTA ethical framework and Mississippi's statutory and regulatory requirements. Let's review the learning objectives for this course. By the end, you'll be able to do the following. First, identify the 6 bioethical principles that form the foundation of physical therapy ethical practice. Second, describe the 9 ethical commitments of the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics for the physical therapy profession. Third, explain how the Realm Individual Process Situation model, known as the RIPS model, guides ethical decision-making in physical therapy practice. Fourth, recognize Mississippi-specific licensure and scope of practice requirements under the Mississippi Physical Therapy Practice Law. Fifth, list the supervision requirements that Mississippi law imposes on physical therapists overseeing assistance and support personnel. The 6th objective is to define the grounds for disciplinary action under the Mississippi State Board of Physical Therapy. And 7th, state the Mississippi physical therapist's legal and ethical obligations regarding informed consent. With those objectives in mind, let's begin with the foundations of physical therapy ethics. Module 1. Foundations of Physical Therapy Ethics, Ethical Theories and Bioethics Principles. Physical therapy holds a distinctive position among the health professions. Its reliance on physical touch as a core therapeutic modality, the prolonged nature of patient-therapist relationships, and its rehabilitation-oriented focus on function and capacity create ethical complexities that other clinical disciplines don't fully share. The physical therapy ethics literature has been grounded mostly in principlism, the four principles framework articulated by Beauchamp and Childress, with three major ethical theories serving as the foundational frameworks in professional education and clinical reasoning. Here's something worth sitting with, though. A systematic scoping review covering 108 studies, searched through October of 2024, found that ethical reasoning in clinical practice is often situational and intuitive, and that formal codes of ethics are frequently seen as disconnected from clinical reality. That finding tells us why we need to understand not only the content of ethical codes, but also the theoretical frameworks they come from, and the practical reasoning processes through which they're applied. Let's begin with the first of the three core theories, deontological ethics, which is duty-based. Deontological ethics, rooted in Kantian philosophy, holds that actions are morally right or wrong based on adherence to duties, rules, or obligations, independent of their consequences. In physical therapy, this framework has also been called formalism. The central question under deontological reasoning is whether an action fulfills universal moral obligations, such as respect for human dignity, honesty, and the duty to do no harm. The APTA Code of Ethics works as a deontological instrument, prescribing specific duties and obligations across clinical, organizational, and business contexts. The 2009 revision of the Code, a 4-year process co-chaired by Laura Lee Swisher, expanded these deontological obligations to address all 5 roles of the physical therapist, and for the first time, it folded in duties related to organizational conduct and social accountability. Informed consent is a textbook example of a deontological obligation. Its moral foundation rests on the patient's right to self-determination and the therapist's matching duty to provide adequate information, regardless of whether outcomes might be improved through incomplete disclosure. Bruckner's well-known 1987 analysis of the double-agent dilemma in sports physical therapy applied formalism directly, concluding that under deontological reasoning, the therapist's duty to the patient's welfare is paramount, regardless of consequences to the employment relationship. That analysis showed something important. When loyalty to patients conflicts with loyalty to employers, the duty-based framework resolves the conflict unambiguously in favor of the patient. The second core theory is teleological or consequentialist ethics, which is outcome-based. Teleological or consequentialist ethics judges the morality of actions by their outcomes, rather than by adherence to rules. Utilitarianism, the most prominent form of consequentialism, seeks the greatest good for the greatest number. Playford, Roberts, and Playford showed how act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism lead to very different clinical management approaches, from case-by-case decisions about the withdrawal of treatment to the universal continuation of care, which illustrates the practical stakes of consequentialist reasoning in rehabilitation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, physical therapy practitioners ran into utilitarian dilemmas around the allocation of scarce resources and triage decisions in acute care, and moral distress followed from having to weigh individual patient needs against population-level benefit. Swisher examined that moral distress as a crisis of moral agency in the post-pandemic era, arguing that the profession needed to move beyond the immediate crisis response and build stronger, more reliable frameworks for ethical reasoning under conditions of uncertainty and scarcity. Gorman Badar used the term teleological in a distinct philosophical sense, drawing on Pellegrino's framework to identify the telos, the inherent purpose of physical therapy, as a good process that capacitates patients, rather than simply a good treatment decision. This reframing shifts the consequentialist question away from what outcome did the treatment produce, and toward did the process itself serve the patient's capacity for function. The third core theory is virtue ethics, which is character-based. Virtue ethics focuses on the character of the moral agent rather than on rules or outcomes. It asks, what kind of person should I be, rather than what should I do? The APTA has adopted 8 professional core values, namely accountability, altruism, collaboration, compassion and caring, duty, excellence, integrity, and social responsibility, and they align closely with a virtue ethics framework. A qualitative study of 20 practicing physical therapists found that integrity, compassion and caring, and accountability were well integrated into daily practice, while social responsibility was consistently the least integrated value. An axiological analysis of ethical codes for physiotherapists, an analysis grounded in the philosophical study of values, identified 6 foundational values: care, professionalism, responsibility, fairness, professional integrity, and respect for patient dignity and autonomy. These may exist as qualities of the physiotherapist, which is a distinctly virtue ethics framing, or as functions realized through action. Marmol Lopez and colleagues found that the ethics of the clinical relationship is determined by the attitudes of the practitioner, which are the result of his or her values and previous experiences, with personal values serving as the foundation on which professional values are built. In a large survey of Italian physiotherapists working in cancer rehabilitation, compassionate care stood out as the single most emphasized ethical principle, named more often than any other value, with qualitative themes including relationships can heal, reflecting a virtue-oriented relational ethics. The profession's attention to values formation goes beyond formal ethics instruction. Arnold Gomez and colleagues found that physical therapy students' perception of their knowledge about professional ethics influenced their professional values, while Marquez Soule and colleagues showed that professional values in turn shaped attitudes toward professional ethics, creating a reinforcing cycle between values acquisition and ethical commitment. Let's compare the 3 frameworks. Each one structures clinical decision-making differently. Deontological reasoning asks what the practitioner's duty requires. Consequentialist reasoning asks which course of action produces the best outcome. And virtue ethics asks what a person of good character would do in the situation. In clinical practice, the 3 frameworks often converge. A compassionate practitioner who respects patient autonomy will frequently produce outcomes that maximize patient welfare. When the frameworks diverge, though, practitioners have to recognize which theoretical lens they're applying and understand how each one leads to different conclusions. Bruckner applied all 3 theories to the same physical therapy dilemma, showing that each yields a distinct resolution and that the choice of framework is itself a moral decision. The 2026 APTA Code of Ethics weaves all 3 approaches together. The enforceable standards of conduct reflect a deontological orientation, the core values embody virtue ethics, and the overall framework encourages clinicians to consider the consequences of their decisions for patients, communities, and the profession. Let's shift to the 6 bioethical principles. The ethical practice of physical therapy rests on 6 foundational bioethical principles recognized by the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics for the physical therapy profession: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, veracity, and fidelity. The first 4 make up the classic Beauchamp-Childress framework that has dominated bioethical discourse since the late 20th century. The APTA's inclusion of veracity and fidelity as distinct pillars reflects the profession's recognition that honesty and faithfulness to professional commitments deserve their own articulation rather than being tucked under broader principles. Let's begin with autonomy. Autonomy means respecting the rights of individuals to make decisions and determinations about their own life and body to the greatest extent possible. In physical therapy, it shows up primarily through informed consent, shared decision-making, and respect for patient self-determination. Despite how central it is, shared decision-making remains markedly underused in clinical practice. An observational study that recorded and analysed more than 200 real clinical consultations, using a validated tool that rates how actively a clinician draws the patient into decisions about their own care, found that genuine shared decision-making was almost entirely absent. measured against what full patient involvement would look like, the observed level of involvement sat near the very bottom of what the tool could register. In plain terms, shared decision-making was essentially not happening. While roughly a third of patients said they wanted a real say in decisions about their care, therapists mostly believed they should be the primary decision-makers, reflecting a paternalistic approach that persists across practice settings. Hoffman, Lewis, and Marr argued that shared decision-making should be integral to physiotherapy practice, involving collaborative discussion of treatment options, expected benefits, potential harms, and patient values. A 2026 mixed method study of home care physical therapy confirmed that shared decision-making is complex and affected by setting-specific contextual factors, including competing loyalties that may cause ethical distress. A cross-sectional survey of 357 German physiotherapists found that a clear majority, more than 3 in 5, had no prior knowledge of shared decision-making at all, and roughly 2/3 reported using a paternalistic approach in routine care. The autonomy-paternalism tension is the most frequently discussed ethical conflict in the physical therapy literature. In rehabilitation, particularly after sudden, severe impairment, practitioners have recognized that patients need practical bodily experience, not merely verbal information, to develop enough understanding for autonomous choices. The second principle is beneficence. Beneficence is the obligation to take action ensuring the welfare and safety of individuals and to advance the good of the individual and society. It's foundational to physical therapy practice. Gorman Badar proposed that physical therapy's clinical truth is not a good treatment decision, but rather a good process that capacitates patients, describing a relational, process-oriented form of beneficence. A qualitative study of 15 physiotherapists found that the ethics of the clinical relationship is very centered on ethics of indication, founded mainly on the principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. In the same large survey of cancer rehabilitation physiotherapists, beneficence and non-maleficence were explicitly prioritized by only a modest share of respondents, ranking below both compassionate care and respect for self-determination, which were the principles emphasized most often. Institutional and fiscal constraints create moral dilemmas, where the therapist's primary moral responsibility, helping the patient progress toward functional capacity, is limited by productivity demands, reimbursement rules, and restricted insurance benefits. The double-agent dilemma arises when loyalty to the patient, which is the core expression of beneficence, conflicts with loyalty to the employer or payer. The third principle is non-maleficence. Non-maleficence means making decisions and taking actions with the intention to prevent or minimize injury, harm, or wrongdoing. It takes on unique dimensions in physical therapy because of the profession's reliance on physical touch. The scoping review flagged physical touch, professional boundaries, and moral distress as key challenges that grow out of physical therapy's embodied nature. A national survey found that the overwhelming majority of physical therapy clinicians, more than 4 in 5, had experienced inappropriate patient sexual behavior at some point over their careers, which highlights the boundary challenges built into hands-on practice. In cancer rehabilitation, defensive prudence, a risk aversion captured by the stance, "it's better not to take risks," was the third most commonly expressed ethical stance among respondents, reflecting a strong non-maleficence orientation that can create tension with beneficence when potentially helpful but risky interventions are withheld. During the COVID-19 pandemic, physical therapists faced heightened non-maleficence concerns about the risk of transmitting infection through hands-on care and uncertainty about whether outpatient physical therapy counted as essential services. The fourth principle is justice. Justice means making objective decisions that result in the most equitable outcome possible, as an expression of mutual respect for human dignity and an acknowledgement of interdependent community. It's arguably the least consensually understood and least developed principle in physical therapy ethics. Edwards, Delaney, Townsend, and Swisher identified a disconnect between the societal obligations expressed in revised physical therapy codes and the individualist ethical frameworks that mostly underpin them. They proposed the capability approach to justice, drawing on the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, as a stronger framework for addressing structural inequities. Among those same Italian physiotherapists in cancer rehabilitation, justice and equity ranked dead last, the least prioritized principle of all, chosen by only a small fraction of respondents. Even though qualitative analysis surfaced the theme, everyone deserves care. In practice, justice concerns show up most sharply in resource allocation and triage decisions, where allocation based on perceived patient need and potential to benefit serve as central guiding principles, but the explicit inclusion of equity domains such as discrimination and ensuring equal capability to be healthy remains limited. Geographic disparities in physical therapy access are well documented, with pronounced gaps in rural and underserved regions. The fifth principle is veracity. Veracity means being honest and truthful in all professional decisions and actions, with all internal and external parties. The 2026 APTA Code recognizes it as a distinct foundational principle. The principle reaches beyond truthful communication with patients to cover honesty in documentation, billing, the reporting of research findings, and professional representation. Veracity is put into practice through multiple enforceable standards of conduct in the 2026 Code, including requirements for truthful clinical documentation under Ethical Commitment 5 and truthful billing practices under Ethical Commitment 6. The sixth principle is fidelity. Fidelity means treating all individuals, groups, and populations with respect, fairness, discretion, and integrity. It captures the dimension of faithfulness to professional commitments and trust relationships. In physical therapy, fidelity shows in the practitioner's sustained commitment to the patient's goals throughout the course of care, in following through on obligations to colleagues and the interprofessional team, and in maintaining professional standards that keep public trust intact. Together, veracity and fidelity extend the Beauchamp-Childress framework to address dimensions of professional conduct that matter especially in a profession built on sustained therapeutic relationships and on the public's trust in practitioner honesty. The theoretical principles we've described gain their practical weight when practitioners hit situations where principles conflict, where institutional pressures compete with patient welfare, or where clinical uncertainty leaves the right course of action unclear. 5 distinct types of ethical situations are recognized in physical therapy practice. Ethical distress occurs when the practitioner knows the right action, but faces barriers to carrying it out, such as institutional pressure, resource constraints, or power dynamics. An ethical dilemma arises when 2 or more ethically defensible but mutually exclusive courses of action exist, a right versus right conflict. An ethical problem involves uncertainty about what the right course of action actually is. Ethical temptation occurs when the practitioner knows the right action, but could benefit from doing wrong, a right versus wrong conflict. And finally, ethical silence describes situations where ethical values are being challenged, but no one names or discusses the challenge, a passive response often tied to moral distress. Let's look at how these principles play out in clinical dilemmas, starting with resource allocation and justice in practice. Resource allocation dilemmas put justice in direct tension with beneficence. Physical therapists operationalize justice through triage systems, yet an analysis of 13 Australian hospital physiotherapy triage policies found that while allocation based on perceived patient need and overall health outcomes were central guiding principles, the explicit inclusion of equity domains was limited. Triage reliability is itself a concern. Agreement between clinicians making community rehabilitation triage decisions was only moderate, meaning 2 qualified clinicians reviewing the same patient frequently arrived at different urgency ratings. They disagreed in roughly 1 out of every 3 cases, and agreement was especially poor for the most urgent category, which is exactly where a misjudgment carries the highest stakes for the patient. The pandemic exposed the absence of physical therapy-specific crisis allocation frameworks, which generated moral distress among acute care practitioners who lacked structured guidance for rationing decisions. Next, consider patient refusal and the autonomy beneficence tension. When patients decline recommended interventions, practitioners have to navigate the tension between respecting autonomy and fulfilling the duty of beneficence. Anderson and Delaney identified a spectrum of treatment pressures. Persuasion, defined as rational argument appealing to the patient's own values, is ethically acceptable. Incentives that highlight natural positive consequences are acceptable. Inducements offering rewards not naturally connected to treatment are ethically ambiguous. Threats warning of negative consequences for non-participation are not acceptable. And compulsion, which explicitly overrides the patient's expressed wishes, is not acceptable. This framework gives practitioners a structured method for evaluating their own responses to patient reluctance. Research on autonomy-supportive therapist behaviors shows that supporting patient self-determination isn't merely an ethical obligation. It's associated with better clinical outcomes, which lines beneficence up with autonomy in a reinforcing rather than a competing relationship. Let's consider surrogate decision-making. When patients lack decision-making capacity, the ethical basis for clinical decisions rests on two standards. The first is substituted judgment, in which surrogates make the decisions they believe the patient would have made. The second is the best interest standard, used when the patient's wishes can't be ascertained. Capacity is decision-specific, exists on a spectrum rather than as a yes or no determination, and is open to disagreement among assessors. Supported decision-making represents a real shift away from the binary capacity-incapacity model. Douglas and Bigby developed the first evidence-based practice framework for supported decision-making through systematic review and grounded theory studies with people who have cognitive disabilities. Largent and colleagues describe supported decision-making as a promising alternative for people with marginal capacity, such as those with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, and it's now recognized by law in a growing number of United States jurisdictions. Stroke rehabilitation research has documented a characteristic trajectory from paternalism on admission to shared decision-making at discharge, with patients sometimes experiencing paternalistic approaches kept in place longer than necessary. That pattern suggests therapists may underestimate how quickly patients regain autonomous decision-making capacity. Let's examine the double agent dilemma and institutional pressure. Bruckner introduced the double agent concept to physical therapy in 1987, defining it as the conflict between loyalty to patients and loyalty to employers. The strongest empirical evidence for this tension comes from skilled nursing facility settings. Cantu surveyed physical therapists across 9 practice settings and found that skilled nursing facility-based therapists had the lowest perceptions of their ethical work environment of any group, and they were the only group whose ratings fell below the level considered the threshold for a healthy ethical work climate. Their primary concerns were overutilization, productivity standards, and billing and coding issues, with the Medicare reimbursement system described as rewarding quantity over quality. Among UK physiotherapists, nearly all, more than 9 in 10, presented with moderate to high levels of burnout, and perfectionism and moral injury together explained a large share of the difference in burnout from one therapist to the next. In workers' compensation settings, Houdon and colleagues interviewed 40 physical therapists across 3 Canadian provinces and found that treatments for compensated workers differed markedly from those for other patients at the same clinic, putting practitioners in positions where they couldn't always act in line with their professional judgment. Peterson, Shepard, Farrell, and Ron argued that these patterns point to a systemic need for higher standards in physical therapy professional development, including more rigorous preparation for navigating the ethical complexities of today's practice environments. Let's close Module 1 by bridging theory and practice. A consistent finding across the physical therapy ethics literature is a gap between ethical theory and clinical application. Formal codes provide essential normative guidance, but they can't address the complexity and ambiguity of every clinical situation. Several frameworks have been proposed to bridge that gap. The active engagement model, developed by Delaney, Edwards, Jensen, and Skinner, offers 3 practical steps: listen actively, think reflexively, and reason critically, designed to build moral agency and turn theoretical knowledge into ethically informed clinical behavior. Edwards, Delaney, Townsend, and Swisher proposed the capability approach to justice as a way to fold equity considerations into clinical reasoning, addressing health inequities that purely individualist ethical frameworks may miss. Hunt and Els developed a patient-centered care ethics analysis model for rehabilitation, informed by the International Classification of Functioning framework that encourages shared control between practitioner and patient and a whole-person understanding of the patient. Gorman Badar adapted Pellegrino's philosophy of medicine to articulate physical therapy's internal morality, proposing that the profession's clinical truth is not merely a good treatment decision, but a good process that capacitates patients. That reframes the goal of ethical practice from producing outcomes to sustaining a therapeutic process worthy of the patient's trust. Together, these models point to a critical insight. Codes of ethics establish the floor of professional conduct, but ethical practice calls for ongoing reflection, situational judgment, and a commitment to character development that goes beyond rule following. The RIPS model of ethical decision-making, which we examine in detail in Module 3, provides the structured methodology through which practitioners can systematically work through the ethical terrain that the principles and theories in this module define. Module 2. The 2026 APTA Code of Ethics and Professional Standards. Let's begin with the historical evolution of APTA ethics standards. The American Physical Therapy Association has maintained a code of ethics since 1935, making it one of the earliest health professions to codify ethical expectations for its practitioners. For decades, the professional ethics framework consisted of 4 separate documents: the Code of Ethics for the Physical Therapist, the Guide for Professional Conduct, the Standards of Ethical Conduct for the Physical Therapist Assistant, and the Guide for Conduct of the Physical Therapist Assistant. Under that structure, broad general principles lived in the House of Delegates' adopted codes, while specific practice obligations were spelled out in the Ethics Committee's interpretive guides. In June of 2009, the APTA House of Delegates approved a thorough revision of both the code and the standards, effective July 1, 2010. This revision, the product of a 4-year process led by the task force to revise the core ethics documents, co-chaired by Laura Lee Swisher, fundamentally reshaped the profession's ethical framework. The revision absorbed the guide documents into the codes themselves, expanded the scope of ethical obligations to address all 5 roles of the physical therapist, namely clinician, educator, administrator, researcher, and consultant. Spelled out ethical responsibilities in organizational and business contexts for the first time, aligned the framework with APTA Vision 2020, and brought in explicit attention to health inequities and social injustice. That expansion mattered because it moved the profession's ethical obligations beyond the individual patient encounter to take in the organizational, institutional, and societal dimensions of practice, a shift that anticipated many of the contemporary challenges the 2026 code would later address. Let's look at the 2020 code. The 2020 Code of Ethics for the Physical Therapist contained 8 principles. They addressed respect for inherent dignity and rights, trustworthiness and compassion, accountability for sound professional judgment, integrity in relationships, the fulfillment of legal and professional obligations, lifelong expertise development, the promotion of beneficial organizational and business practices, and participation in meeting health needs locally, nationally, and globally. The parallel standards of ethical conduct for the physical therapist assistant contained 8 mirroring standards. While these documents were a significant advance over their predecessors, keeping separate instruments for physical therapists and physical therapist assistants preserved a structural division within the profession's ethical identity, a division at odds with the increasingly collaborative and integrated nature of physical therapy service delivery. Now let's examine the 2026 unification. On July 14, 2025, the APTA House of Delegates adopted a new Code of Ethics for the physical therapy profession, a milestone document combining the former code and the PTA standards into a single unified standard for the first time in the profession's history. Effective January 1st, 2026. The new code modernizes the ethical framework to address decision-making in the era of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. The unification carries both symbolic and practical weight. Symbolically, it affirms that physical therapists and physical therapist assistants share a single professional ethical identity. Practically, it removes the interpretive ambiguity that came up when separate documents use different language to express parallel obligations. The transition provisions specify that complaints about alleged violations occurring on or after January 1st, 2026 are assessed under the new code, while complaints related to pre-2026 conduct may continue to be evaluated under the prior documents through December 31st, 2027. This 2-year overlap makes sure that practitioners who operated in good faith under the prior framework aren't retroactively judged against standards that didn't yet exist during the relevant conduct period. Let's turn now to the 9 ethical commitments. The 2026 Code of Ethics for the physical therapy profession identifies 9 ethical commitments, each paired with enforceable standards of conduct and aspirational illustrative examples. The distinction between enforceable standards and aspirational examples is structurally significant. Standards of conduct establish the mandatory ethical floor, the minimum expectations every practitioner must meet, while illustrative examples describe the higher aspirational behaviors that mark exemplary practice, but whose absence doesn't by itself constitute an ethical violation. Ethical commitment 1 is respect. Physical therapists and physical therapist assistants shall respect the inherent dignity and rights of all individuals. The enforceable standards require non-discrimination and the protection of confidential information. Aspirational illustrative examples include acknowledging and respecting an individual's known identity and culture, and recognizing both explicit and implicit personal biases. The inclusion of implicit bias recognition is an evolution from earlier versions of the code, reflecting the profession's growing attention to the systemic dimensions of equity and inclusion. Ethical commitment. 2 is integrity. Practitioners shall act with professional integrity and responsibility and fulfill their legal and ethical obligations. The standards specify that the physical therapist keeps full responsibility for all physical therapy services, that ongoing informed consent must be obtained, that colleagues who may be unfit to practice safely must be reported, that known illegal or unethical acts must be addressed, that mandatory reporter laws must be followed, and that research participant protections must be observed. The emphasis on ongoing rather than merely initial informed consent reflects an important conceptual advance. It aligns with the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy's 2025 Informed Consent Guide, which lays out 4 dimensions of decisional capacity and treats consent as a continuous process throughout the therapeutic relationship. Ethical commitment 3 is accountability. Practitioners shall be accountable for sound professional judgments within their scope of practice. The standards prohibit exceeding one's professional, jurisdictional, and personal scope. They require practice free from impairment due to substance misuse or cognitive deficiency, and they mandate compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Standard 3D specifically addresses accountability for the accuracy and truthfulness of information disseminated, including in the use of emerging technologies such as social media and artificial intelligence. This provision responds directly to the spread of digital communication channels through which inaccurate clinical information can be rapidly amplified and widely shared. Ethical commitment. 4 is maintaining professional relationships. Practitioners shall respect the boundaries of professional relationships in order to promote a safe environment. The standards prohibit the exploitative use of authority, sexual relationships with patients, supervisees, or students, and harassment of any kind. They also require reasonable notice and the identification of alternative sources when terminating the provider relationship. These provisions address the power imbalances built into clinical, supervisory, and educational relationships, a concern that is especially pointed in physical therapy, given the profession's reliance on physical touch and the often prolonged nature of patient-therapist interactions. Ethical commitment 5 is compassion and trust. Practitioners shall be trustworthy and compassionate in addressing patient rights and needs. The standards require providing the information necessary for informed decisions, ensuring the truthfulness and accuracy of clinical documentation, and addressing communication barriers. Standard 5C addresses professional responsibility when using current and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, specifying that practitioners must keep their professional obligations to patients, regardless of the technological tools used in care delivery. Ethical commitment 6 is responsible business and organizational practices. Practitioners shall promote accountable and truthful organizational behaviors and business practices. The standards mandate truthful and accurate service information and billing, documentation that accurately reflects the services rendered, the disclosure of conflicts of interest, the refusal of gifts that may influence clinical judgment, the disclosure of financial interests in recommended products, informing patients of their financial obligations, and not entering into employment arrangements that prevent the fulfillment of ethical obligations. This last provision, the ban on accepting employment conditions that compromise ethical practice, gives practitioners an affirmative ethical basis for refusing organizational mandates that conflict with patient welfare, speaking directly to the double-agent dilemma we examined in Module 1, Ethical Commitment. 7 is direction and supervision. Practitioners shall provide appropriate direction and communication with supervised personnel. The standards require ensuring that delegated duties match the credentials and scope of the individual performing them. That physical therapist assistants practice under the direction of a physical therapist. That the physical therapist holds primary responsibility for the supervision of physical therapist assistants and support personnel. That physical therapist assistants support and respect the supervisory role, and that physical therapist assistants communicate their limitations and needs to the supervising physical therapist. These provisions establish the ethical foundation for the supervisory framework that Mississippi law implements through detailed regulatory requirements, as we examine in Module 5. Ethical commitment. 8 is professional expertise. Practitioners shall enhance their expertise through career-long learning. The standards require recognizing and practicing within the limits of one's current skills and competence, referring patients to other providers when appropriate, and practicing consistent with accepted current standards. Standard 8A specifically addresses developing competence in using current and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, and evaluating the strength of evidence before bringing new content into practice. This standard makes technology literacy an affirmative ethical obligation rather than just an optional professional development goal, a distinction with direct implications for Mississippi practitioners who use or encounter AI-assisted tools in clinical settings. Ethical commitment. 9 is societal responsibility. Practitioners shall participate in efforts to meet health needs locally, nationally, and globally. This commitment is entirely aspirational, containing no enforceable standards of conduct. The illustrative examples include providing resources to those in harm's way, addressing social determinants of health, advocating to reduce health disparities, engaging in interprofessional collaboration, providing pro bono services, and practicing responsible stewardship of healthcare services. The fully aspirational character of societal responsibility reflects a deliberate policy judgment. While the profession recognizes the moral importance of social engagement, it doesn't compel specific forms of societal participation through enforceable standards. Let's now examine the APTA core values and the 6 foundational principles. The 2026 Code builds on 6 foundational ethical principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, veracity, and fidelity that provide the philosophical grounding for the 9 ethical commitments. These principles, which we examined in detail in Module 1, work in the Code not as independent standards, but as the conceptual infrastructure that gives coherence and justification to the specific standards of conduct and illustrative examples within each commitment. Autonomy undergirds the consent and non-discrimination provisions. Beneficence and non-maleficence inform the standards on scope of practice and competency. Justice supports the aspirational commitment to health equity. Veracity grounds the requirements for honest documentation and billing. And fidelity sustains the expectations of faithfulness to professional relationships and public trust. Alongside these principles, the APTA identifies 8 core values for physical therapists and physical therapist assistants: accountability, altruism, collaboration, compassion and caring, duty, excellence, integrity, and social responsibility. The core values occupy a distinctive position in the profession's ethical architecture. Where the Code of Ethics works mainly as a deontological instrument, prescribing specific duties and prohibitions, the core values embody a virtue ethics orientation, describing the character traits and professional dispositions that define exemplary practice. Put simply, the Code tells practitioners what is expected of them. The core values shape who they aspire to be, and the RIPS model, examined in Module 3, provides the analytical process for working through situations where expectations and aspirations meet the complexities of practice. Research on how core values get integrated into clinical practice reveals both strengths and persistent challenges. McGuinness, Ginther, and Wainwright conducted a qualitative study of 20 practicing physical therapists and found that integrity, compassion and caring, and accountability were well integrated into daily practice. These 3 values, each closely tied to direct patient care relationships, appeared to be deeply embedded in practitioners' professional identities and readily actionable in clinical encounters. By contrast, social responsibility was consistently identified as the least integrated core value, with practitioners reporting difficulty translating its broad aspirational mandate into concrete professional behaviors. This finding has implications for the 2026 Code's Ethical Commitment 9, Societal Responsibility, which faces the same challenge of operationalization in a profession whose daily practice centers on individual patient encounters. A comparative view brings out the APTA framework's distinctive features. The Beauchamp-Childress Principalist framework serves as the common foundation for codes across physical therapy, nursing, occupational therapy, and medicine, but each profession applies these principles in ways that reflect its unique clinical identity. Gorman-Badar articulated physical therapy's distinctive internal morality, the profession's clinical truth as a good process that capacitates patients, setting it apart from medicine's orientation toward a good treatment decision. The American Nurses Association Code uniquely includes self-care as an explicit ethical duty, a provision absent from the APTA framework, but increasingly seen as relevant given the high burnout rates documented among physical therapy practitioners. The Interprofessional Education Collaborative Core Competencies, updated in 2023, define 4 domains for collaborative practice: values and ethics, roles and responsibilities, interprofessional communication, and teams and teamwork. And the 2023 revision explicitly embedded anti-oppressive practice concepts. Even so, a 2025 scoping review found that impediments to interprofessional identity development persist, including professional stereotyping and hierarchies reinforced by the dominant uni-professional culture of work environments. The relationship between the code and the core values reflects a deeper philosophical integration. A practitioner who cultivates the core value of integrity, for example, doesn't merely avoid dishonesty because the code prohibits it. The practitioner is honest because honesty is part of the kind of professional they aspire to be. This distinction between compliance-driven and character-driven ethical behavior sits at the heart of the relationship between deontological codes and virtue-based values in professional ethics, and it explains why the APTA framework relies on both instruments rather than on either one alone. Let's close Module 2 by examining Mississippi's incorporation by reference. The significance of the APTA Code of Ethics and core values is amplified for Mississippi practitioners by the state's incorporation by reference mechanism. The Mississippi Administrative Code, Title 30, Part 3103, Rule 3.4, requires all licensees to comply with the current APTA Code of Ethics and the accompanying Guide for Professional Conduct, and with the APTA Standards of Practice and the accompanying criteria. Through this regulatory provision, the APTA Code isn't merely a voluntary professional guideline for Mississippi practitioners, it carries the force of Mississippi law. The Board's express statutory purpose is to safeguard the public's health, safety, and welfare by establishing minimum qualifications and imposing disciplinary sanctions against persons who don't meet or adhere to the standards set forth in its regulations. The regulatory enforcement dimension is twofold. Under Rule 6.1, Paragraph 19, failure to adhere to recognized professional ethical standards is an independent ground for disciplinary action by the Mississippi State Board of Physical Therapy. So a Mississippi practitioner who violates the enforceable standards of conduct in the 2026 Code may face not only APTA ethics and judicial committee proceedings, which apply only to APTA members and carry membership consequences such as censure, suspension, or expulsion, but also state licensing board discipline, which can range from advisory letters to license revocation. Because Mississippi's incorporation language references the current APTA Code rather than a specific dated version, the transition from the 2020 Code to the 2026 Code automatically updates Mississippi's enforceable ethical standards without requiring separate legislative or regulatory action. This dual enforcement structure, professional association ethics proceedings, and state licensing board discipline creates a fuller accountability framework than either system would provide alone. The APTA Ethics and Judicial Committee can address violations among its voluntary membership, but it can't affect a practitioner's legal authorization to practice. The Mississippi State Board of Physical Therapy can impose sanctions up to and including license revocation, but it acts within the scope of its statutory jurisdiction and disciplinary procedures. Together, the two systems make sure that ethical violations carry both professional and legal consequences, reinforcing the expectation that the Code's standards of conduct are non-negotiable requirements for Mississippi practitioners. The incorporation mechanism also means that the 2026 Code's technology provisions are now enforceable components of Mississippi regulatory law. These include Standard 3D, addressing accountability for information disseminated through social media and artificial intelligence, Standard 5C, addressing professional responsibility in the use of emerging technologies, and Standard 8A, addressing the development of competence in artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. Mississippi practitioners who use AI-assisted documentation tools, engage in social media communication about clinical topics, or employ telehealth technologies must therefore satisfy not only the practical requirements of these tools, but the ethical standards in the 2026 Code, with failure to do so amounting to a potential ground for board discipline. We examined these contemporary practice challenges in detail in Module 7. Module 3, the RIPS model of ethical decision-making. Let's begin by considering why codes alone aren't enough. The preceding modules established the ethical theories, the bioethical principles, and the professional standards that define the normative framework for physical therapy practice. Yet, a persistent finding across the literature is that knowing what the rules require isn't the same as knowing how to act when those rules conflict, when institutional pressures complicate their application, or when the right course of action is genuinely uncertain. The most thorough scoping review of physical therapy ethics, which winnowed many thousands of screened publications down to 108 directly relevant studies and was searched through October of 2024, found that ethical reasoning in clinical practice is often situational and intuitive, and that formal codes of ethics are frequently seen as disconnected from the realities of everyday clinical decision-making. Codes of ethics work as deontological instruments that prescribe obligations, but they don't provide a structured process for navigating situations where those obligations conflict with one another or with the institutional, financial, and interpersonal pressures that practitioners run into. The gap between ethical principles and clinical application isn't a recent observation. Swisher's retrospective analysis of the physical therapy ethics literature from 1970 through 2000 documented that publications were predominantly philosophical, focused narrowly on the moral judgment component of ethical reasoning, and addressed mainly the patient-client management role of the physical therapist. That literature left significant gaps in the other components of moral behavior: moral sensitivity, moral motivation, and moral courage, as well as in the organizational and societal dimensions of ethical practice. The limits of code-based approaches show up again in empirical research demonstrating that personal values serve as the foundation on which professional values are built, and that the ethics of the clinical relationship is determined by the attitudes of the practitioner, which are the result of his or her values and previous experiences. Professional codes can define minimum expectations, but on their own, they can't produce the moral sensitivity, the reflective capacity, and the practical wisdom that ethical practice demands. These findings point to the need for a structured decision-making methodology that bridges the gap between ethical knowledge and clinical action, a framework that helps practitioners recognize ethical issues when they arise, analyze them systematically, and reach defensible courses of action, even when principles conflict and institutional pressures run high. The Realm Individual Process Situation model, developed specifically for physical therapy, provides exactly that methodology. Let's examine the three dimensions of the RIPS model. The Realm Individual Process Situation model, abbreviated RIPS, was developed by Laura Lee, known as Dolly Swisher, along with Ellie Arslanian and C.M. Davis, in 2005, as a thorough ethical decision-making framework designed specifically for physical therapy. The model brings together four foundational theoretical contributions: Rushworth-Kidder's analysis of right versus right dilemmas, Jack Glazer's three realms of ethics, namely individual, institutional, and societal, James Rest's four-component model of moral behavior, and Ruth Patillo's taxonomy of ethical situations. By integrating these theoretical streams, the RIPS model provides a multidimensional analytical structure that addresses the full complexity of ethical reasoning in physical therapy practice. Let's start with the realm dimension. The first dimension of the RIPS model identifies the context, the realm, in which the ethical situation occurs. Three realms are recognized. The individual realm covers ethical issues arising in the direct relationship between the practitioner and the patient, the traditional focus of bioethics, and the context in which most clinical ethical reasoning happens. The organizational or institutional realm covers ethical issues arising from workplace policies, employer expectations, productivity demands, and reimbursement pressures, the structural context in which clinical care is delivered. And the societal realm covers ethical issues involving healthcare access, resource allocation, public policy, and the profession's broader social responsibilities. Recognizing the realm is the first analytical step, because the same clinical situation may present very different ethical dimensions depending on whether it's analyzed at the individual, organizational, or societal level. A productivity mandate that pressures a therapist to cut treatment time, for example, is an individual realm issue when the therapist's patient is directly harmed, an organizational realm issue when the policy systematically compromises care across the practice, and a societal realm issue when it reflects reimbursement structures that reward volume over quality. The second dimension is the individual process dimension. It draws on James Rest's four-component model of moral behavior to identify the internal processes through which practitioners engage with ethical situations. Moral sensitivity is the ability to recognize that an ethical issue exists, to perceive the ethical dimensions of a clinical situation that might otherwise feel merely administrative, interpersonal, or logistical. Without moral sensitivity, ethical issues pass unrecognized and unaddressed, a failure that can be especially consequential in settings where organizational norms have normalized ethically questionable practices. Moral judgment is the ability to determine the right course of action once an ethical issue has been recognized, to reason through competing principles, weigh consequences, and reach a defensible conclusion. Moral motivation is the commitment to prioritize ethical values over competing personal, organizational, or financial interests. The willingness to place moral considerations above self-interest when the two conflict. And moral courage is the willingness to implement the ethical decision despite obstacles, fear, or personal cost. The four components form a sequential chain. A practitioner has to first perceive the issue, which is sensitivity, then determine the right response, which is judgment, then commit to that response over competing interests, which is motivation, and finally act on that commitment in the face of potential consequences, which is courage. A failure at any point in this chain, whether it's failing to recognize the issue, misjudging the right action, prioritizing self-interest, or lacking the courage to act, can result in ethically inadequate behavior, even when the practitioner knows the ethical principles inside and out. The third dimension is the situation dimension. It classifies the type of ethical scenario the practitioner faces, drawing on the 5 types of ethical situations introduced in Module 1. The ethical dilemma, ethical distress, ethical temptation, ethical silence, and the ethical problem of genuine uncertainty. Within the RIPS framework, classifying the situation correctly is essential, because each type calls for a different analytical and practical response. Dilemmas require principled deliberation, distress requires strategies to overcome barriers, temptation requires moral motivation to resist self-interest, and silence requires the courage to raise uncomfortable questions. Now let's walk through the 4 steps of the RIPS model. The model puts its 3 dimensions into action through a structured 4-step decision-making process. Step 1 is to recognize and define the ethical issues. The practitioner identifies the conflicting ethical principles, values, or virtues at stake in the situation. This step means determining the realm in which the issue primarily resides, individual, organizational, or societal, and classifying the type of ethical situation as a dilemma, distress, temptation, silence, or problem. The practitioner also identifies which components of the individual process are engaged, whether the challenge lies in recognizing the issue, determining the right action, sustaining moral motivation, or summoning moral courage. Step 2 is to reflect. The practitioner gathers and considers all relevant information, including the factual circumstances, the perspectives of all stakeholders, the applicable professional codes of ethics and standards, the relevant laws and regulations, and the potential consequences of various courses of action. Reflection also involves examining the practitioner's own values, biases, and emotional responses, since these inevitably shape ethical reasoning. In the Mississippi context, this step means consulting not only the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics, but also the Mississippi-specific regulatory requirements that carry the force of state law through Rule 3.4's incorporation by reference mechanism. Step 3 is to decide the right thing to do. The practitioner applies one or more ethical decision-making approaches to determine the most defensible course of action. 3 approaches are recognized within the RIPS framework. A rules-based approach follows existing rules, regulations, and professional standards, the deontological perspective that asks what duty requires. An ends-based approach focuses on achieving the best outcome or avoiding the worst, the consequentialist perspective that asks which action produces the greatest good. And a care-based approach prioritizes maintaining relationships and fulfilling responsibilities to those in one's care, a relational perspective that centers the therapeutic relationship and the practitioner's fiduciary obligation to the patient. In practice, these approaches frequently converge, but when they diverge, the practitioner has to consciously select and justify the reasoning framework applied. Step 4 is to implement, evaluate, and reassess. The practitioner puts the decision into action, monitors the results, and stays ready to reassess if circumstances change or if the anticipated outcomes don't materialize. This step recognizes that ethical decision-making isn't a one-time event but an ongoing process, and that the consequences of a decision may reveal ethical dimensions that weren't apparent during the initial analysis. The implementation phase is where moral courage is most directly tested because the practitioner has to act on the decision despite potential institutional resistance, interpersonal conflict, or professional risk. The value of the RIPS model comes through most clearly when we apply it to the recurring ethical challenges that physical therapists meet in clinical practice. Let's begin with interprofessional disagreements. Physical therapists increasingly function as autonomous practitioners within interprofessional teams, and disagreements with physicians and other providers about patient management are a common source of ethical tension. The scoping review documented that interprofessional disagreements frequently arise in orthopedic and primary care contexts, with physical therapists and physicians sometimes reaching different clinical conclusions based on their respective training and expertise. Under the RIPS model, a therapist who disagrees with a physician's rehabilitation protocol would first recognize the ethical issue as arising in both the individual realm, because the patient's welfare is at stake, and the organizational realm, because the institutional hierarchy may pressure deference to the physician's plan. The individual process dimension requires moral sensitivity to perceive that the disagreement has ethical significance, moral judgment to weigh the competing approaches against the evidence, moral motivation to prioritize the patient's interest over institutional harmony, and moral courage to advocate for the patient's welfare through appropriate channels. The situation may be classified as an ethical dilemma if both approaches have clinical merit, or as ethical distress if the therapist knows the physician's approach is suboptimal but faces institutional barriers to advocating for change. Next, consider dual relationships in rural settings. Rural physical therapy practice brings ethical challenges that are less common in urban settings. In communities with limited healthcare providers, overlapping personal and professional relationships are a structural norm rather than an avoidable risk. The scoping review documented that rural practitioners routinely treat neighbors, acquaintances, and individuals with whom they share community connections, because refusing to do so would deny access to care in settings with no alternative provider. A RIPS analysis identifies this challenge as operating at once in the individual realm, the specific therapeutic relationship, and the societal realm, healthcare access in underserved communities. The ethical situation is a dilemma. Maintaining strict professional boundaries may protect the therapeutic relationship but deny necessary care, while treating individuals with whom one has personal connections may enable access but introduce boundary risks. The care-based decision-making approach within RIPS is particularly relevant here, since it centers the practitioner's responsibility to those in their care and the relational dimensions of the therapeutic encounter. Let's now consider organizational pressure and productivity demands. Institutional pressure to put productivity ahead of clinical quality is one of the most prevalent ethical challenges in physical therapy practice. Cantu surveyed physical therapists across 9 practice settings and found that therapists working in skilled nursing facilities had the lowest perceptions of ethical work environment, and they were the only group whose ratings fell below the level considered the threshold for a healthy ethical work climate. Their primary concerns were overutilization, productivity standards, and billing and coding issues, with the Medicare reimbursement system described as rewarding quantity over quality. The scoping review found that among UK physiotherapists, nearly all, more than 9 in 10 presented with moderate to high levels of burnout, with perfectionism and moral injury together, explaining a large share of the difference in burnout from one therapist to the next. These findings confirm that organizational realm ethical challenges aren't isolated incidents, but systemic features of certain practice environments. The RIPS model takes this on directly by asking practitioners to analyze ethical situations at the organizational level, not merely the individual level, and to recognize that organizational realm pressures, productivity targets, reimbursement incentives, and staffing constraints are ethical issues that warrant systematic analysis and response. Now let's revisit the double agent dilemma through the RIPS lens. Bruckner's well-known 1987 analysis introduced the double agent concept to physical therapy, defining it as the conflict between loyalty to patients and loyalty to employers. If physical therapists act as patient agents, their employment may be threatened, and if they act as employer agents, patients may suffer. Houdon and colleagues confirmed this tension empirically, finding that treatments for compensated injured workers differed markedly from those for other patients at the same clinic, putting practitioners in positions where they couldn't always act in line with their professional judgment. Through the RIPS lens, the double agent dilemma operates across both the individual and organizational realms and typically shows up as ethical distress. The therapist knows the right action, which is advocating for the patient, but faces institutional barriers to carrying it out. Swisher argued that this moral distress reflects a crisis of moral agency in the post-pandemic era, and she called on the profession to build stronger frameworks for ethical reasoning under conditions of uncertainty and competing pressures. Let's close Module 3 by connecting RIPS to Mississippi practice. For Mississippi practitioners, the RIPS model has particular regulatory significance because Mississippi incorporates the current APTA Code of Ethics by reference through Rule 3.4. The ethical obligations analyzed through RIPS aren't merely professional aspirations, but enforceable components of Mississippi law. A Mississippi practitioner who faces organizational pressure to compromise patient care isn't simply experiencing an ethical tension. The practitioner is confronting a potential violation of enforceable regulatory standards. The RIPS model provides the structured methodology through which such situations can be analyzed, the competing obligations identified, and a defensible course of action determined and implemented. Throughout the remaining modules, the RIPS framework will serve as the analytical lens through which Mississippi-specific regulatory requirements, supervision standards, and contemporary practice challenges are examined. Module 4, Mississippi Regulatory Framework, Licensure, and Scope of Practice. With the ethical theories, the 2026 APTA Code, and the RIPS decision-making model now in place, the course turns to the Mississippi-specific legal framework that governs daily practice. Let's begin with the Mississippi State Board of Physical Therapy. The board is the state agency responsible for licensing and regulating physical therapists and physical therapist assistants in Mississippi. It's authorized to establish and enforce its rules and procedures by virtue of the Mississippi Physical Therapy Practice Law, found at sections 73, 23, 31, and following of the Mississippi Code of 1972, annotated. The express statutory purpose of the board's regulations is to safeguard the public's health, safety, and welfare by establishing minimum qualifications and creating exclusive titles corresponding to the level of qualifications for individuals who offer physical therapy services to the public, and to impose disciplinary sanctions, civil or criminal, against persons who don't meet or adhere to the standards set forth in the regulations. The implementing regulations are published in the Mississippi Administrative Code, Title 30, which covers professions and occupations, in Part 3101 on organization and structure, and Part 3103 on licensure, practice, renewal, continuing education, standard of conduct, and fees. These regulations were originally effective July 22, 2003, and they've been amended repeatedly, most recently effective March 7, 2025. When lawfully adopted, the board's rules have the effect of law. The board consists of 7 members as set forth in the Act. 4 licensed physical therapists, 1 licensed physical therapist assistant, 1 licensed physician, and 1 consumer at large. Each professional member must hold an unrestricted license to practice in his or her profession, and the consumer at large may not be associated with or financially interested in any healthcare profession, but must have an interest in consumer rights. The 4 physical therapist members are appointed by the governor from lists of nominees submitted, drawn from each of Mississippi's 4 congressional districts. The board must meet at least once each quarter, and those meetings are held in compliance with the Open Meetings Law. A quorum consists of 4 members, including the chairman, and is necessary for the board to take action by vote. The board's statutory powers and duties are extensive. Under Rule 2.3 of Part 3, 101, and under the Mississippi Code, the board is empowered to examine and determine the qualifications and fitness of applicants, to issue, renew, deny, suspend, or revoke licenses and otherwise discipline licensees, to investigate alleged violations of the practice law and board regulations, to establish fees, to adopt and enforce rules, to maintain a public register of all licensees, to publish at least annually a list of licensees and of all persons disciplined, to report final disciplinary actions to state, federal, and national disciplinary databases, to adopt the American Physical Therapy Association Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, to conduct performance audits and inspections of any place where physical therapy is practiced, to issue subpoenas for witnesses and records, and to conduct criminal history record checks, including fingerprinting of applicants and of licensees under investigation. This wide authority positions the board as both a licensing body and an enforcement agency, with the tools it needs to investigate complaints, compel evidence, and impose meaningful sanctions when standards are violated. Let's turn to licensure requirements. Mississippi law establishes a multi-component licensure pathway that brings together educational, examination, and character requirements. To obtain a Mississippi physical therapist or physical therapist assistant license, an applicant must submit written evidence, verified by oath, that the applicant is of good moral character, has graduated from a physical therapy or physical therapist assistant program accredited by an agency recognized by the United States Department of Education, and paid the application fee, has passed a board-approved national examination with the minimum passing score, and has passed the board's jurisprudence examination. Let's look more closely at good moral character. Mississippi places distinctive emphasis on the good moral character requirement, which Rule 1.1 defines as a pattern of behavior conforming to the profession's ethical standards: honesty, truthfulness, integrity, respect for lawful behavior and the rights of others, and an absence of moral turpitude, meaning conduct that gravely violates accepted standards of honesty, justice, or morality. The board's determination considers criminal convictions or pleas involving felony or misdemeanor offences of moral turpitude, disciplinary actions against any professional licence, prior unlicensed practice, conduct violating the APTA Code of Professional Ethics, and conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deception, or misrepresentation. The burden of demonstrating good moral character rests with the applicant. This requirement creates a direct connection between the APTA ethical standards examined in Module 2 and the initial licensure process. A record of ethical violations may disqualify an applicant before practice ever begins. Let's examine the 2 examinations that Mississippi requires. The board-approved national examination is the National Physical Therapy Examination, developed and administered by the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy to assess entry-level competence. Mississippi imposes a 6-attempt limit. An applicant who has taken the examination more than 6 times in any jurisdiction and is not licensed isn't eligible to sit for the examination in Mississippi. Any person who has taken but not passed the required examination in this or another jurisdiction isn't eligible for any type of license until the examination is passed. Separate from the national examination, Mississippi requires all applicants for licensure to pass the board's jurisprudence examination, which tests knowledge of the Mississippi physical therapy practice law and the board's rules and regulations. The jurisprudence examination isn't a one-time requirement confined to initial licensure. It recurs throughout the licensure life cycle. It's required for initial licensure, for the physical therapy licensure compact privilege to practice, for the initiation and renewal of inactive status, and for reinstatement to active status. This recurring requirement reflects the board's recognition that Mississippi-specific regulatory knowledge has to stay current and can't be satisfied by a single examination taken at the start of a career that may span decades, during which the regulatory framework evolves. Mississippi also provides several alternative pathways to licensure. Mississippi participates in the Physical Therapy Licensure Compact. Applicants who reside in compact participating states are eligible for a privilege to practice in line with the rules of the Physical Therapy Compact Commission, provided they apply for the privilege, pay the required fees, pass the board's jurisprudence examination, and comply with Mississippi practice rules. The compact fee is waived for active United States military members and their spouses. An applicant may instead seek licensure by reciprocity, by demonstrating a valid, unrestricted license in good standing from another United States jurisdiction, whose requirements are equivalent to or greater than Mississippi's. Foreign-trained physical therapists must demonstrate good moral character, a board-approved diploma, a credentials evaluation showing substantial equivalence to United States educational standards, completion of any additional required education, English proficiency as evidenced by minimum TOEFL internet-based test subscores, and passage of the approved examination. Temporary licenses may be issued to applicants who have registered for but not yet taken, or not yet received results from, the examination, subject to direct supervision conditions. A physical therapist holding a temporary license may not supervise other licensees. Mississippi also provides expedited pathways under the Military Family Freedom Act and the Universal Recognition of Occupational Licenses Act, each of which issues a temporary practice permit while the application is processed. Let's now define the scope of physical therapy in Mississippi. The Mississippi Physical Therapy Practice. Law and the board's regulations define physical therapy, or physiotherapy, the terms being deemed identical and interchangeable, as the art and science of a health specialty concerned with the prevention of disability and the physical rehabilitation for congenital or acquired physical or mental disabilities resulting from, or secondary to, injury or disease. The practice of physical therapy covers physical therapy evaluation, treatment planning, treatment administration, instruction, and consultative services. Tests and measurements include performing and interpreting tests and measurements as an aid to physical therapy treatment for the purpose of correcting or alleviating any physical condition and preventing the development of any physical or mental disability within the scope of physical therapy, as well as performing neuromuscular skeletal tests and measurements as an aid in diagnosis, evaluation, or determination of the existence and extent of any body malfunction, and to assess the ongoing effects of intervention. Treatment administration covers therapeutic exercise, neurodevelopmental procedures, therapeutic massage and manual therapy, mechanical devices, and therapeutic agents that employ the physical, chemical, and other properties of air, water, heat, cold, electricity, sound, and radiant energy. The single most important bright line scope limitation in Mississippi is found in Part 3, 103, Rule 3.1, Paragraph 5. No physical therapist shall render a medical diagnosis of a disease. This prohibition is the foundational boundary distinguishing physical therapy from the practice of medicine in Mississippi. A physical therapist may perform a physical therapy evaluation and establish a physical therapy diagnosis, a functional or movement diagnosis guiding the plan of care, but may not diagnose disease. The distinction is critical in the direct access context, where physical therapists evaluate and treat patients without prior physician referral. The authority to evaluate and treat doesn't extend to the authority to diagnose medical conditions. Treating or attempting to treat ailments or health conditions other than by physical therapy as authorized by the regulations is a ground for discipline under Rule 6.1, paragraph 7 and 17. Mississippi's scope of practice framework includes several credential-gated authorities, procedures that fall within the scope of physical therapy, but that require additional qualifications beyond basic licensure. Electromyography and nerve conduction studies may be performed only by a licensed physical therapist who is certified in electromyography by the American Board of Physical Therapy Specialists. Intramuscular dry needling manual therapy is within the scope of physical therapy practice, but may be performed only by a licensed physical therapist who has met the specific education and competency criteria established in the regulations, including 50 hours of instruction from a board-recognized provider and documented competency in the technique. These credential gates reflect a principle that runs through Mississippi's regulatory framework: the distinction between legal authority and documented competency. That distinction deserves emphasis. Rule 3.3, paragraph C, states plainly that a physical therapist must have the knowledge, skill, ability, and documented competency to perform an act that is within the physical therapist's scope of practice. Being legally authorized to perform a technique isn't the same as being competent to perform it. Competency requires education, training, and demonstrated ability beyond the basic legal authorization. Practicing beyond one's competency, even within the scope of practice, is a recognized ground for discipline. This distinction has direct implications for the 2026 APTA Code's technology provisions examined in Module 2. A Mississippi practitioner who uses an AI-assisted documentation tool is legally authorized to do so within the scope of practice, but the practitioner must also have the competency to evaluate the tool's output, catch errors, and make sure the final documentation accurately reflects the services rendered. The competency requirement extends Rule 5.1's general mandate that physical therapists demonstrate continuing competence throughout their careers. Let's examine Mississippi's direct access provisions. Mississippi permits physical therapists to evaluate and, under defined conditions, treat patients without a prescription or referral from another healthcare provider. The governing provisions are found in Part 3, 103, Rule 3.1 on referrals, implementing the Mississippi Code, most recently revised effective 2024. Mississippi, like all 50 states, now provides some form of direct access to physical therapy services. Its framework is best described as provisional direct access, subject to credential and time-based conditions. First, consider evaluation without referral. A physical therapist may, without a prescription or referral, perform an initial evaluation or a consultation of a screening nature to determine the need for physical therapy. This evaluation and screening authority is essentially universal. No credential gate applies. It's the initiation of treatment that triggers the additional requirements. Now consider treatment without referral and the credential gate it carries. For the treatment of a condition within the scope of physical therapy, a physical therapist licensed or privileged to practice in Mississippi may implement treatment with or without a prescription or referral if the physical therapist meets one of two criteria. Either the physical therapist holds a Doctor of Physical Therapy degree from an accredited institution, or the physical therapist has 5 years of licensed clinical practice experience. This credential gate is a distinctive feature of Mississippi law. A newly licensed physical therapist who holds a master's degree rather than a Doctor of Physical Therapy can't provide direct access treatment until accumulating 5 years of clinical experience, a waiting period that reflects the legislature's judgment that advanced education or substantial experience is necessary to safely initiate treatment without physician referral. Independent of the credential gate, a physical therapist may perform physical therapy services without a prescription or referral in several specific referral-exempt circumstances. These are to children with a diagnosed developmental disability, pursuant to the patient's plan of care, as part of a home healthcare agency, pursuant to the patient's plan of care, to a patient in a nursing home pursuant to the patient's plan of care, related to conditioning or providing education or activities in a wellness setting for injury prevention, stress reduction, or fitness promotion, and to an individual for a previously diagnosed condition for which physical therapy services are appropriate, after informing the healthcare provider who rendered the diagnosis, provided the diagnosis was made within the previous 180 days, and the physical therapist provides the diagnosing provider with a plan of care within the first 15 days of intervention. Now we come to Mississippi's central direct access safeguard, the 30-day mandatory referral rule. If the patient hasn't made measurable or functional improvement after 30 calendar days of physical therapy treatment provided under direct access authority, the physical therapist shall refer the patient to an appropriate healthcare provider. The mandatory nature of this obligation is reinforced by the regulation's express statement that the board shall take appropriate disciplinary action against any physical therapist who fails to refer a patient as required by this provision. This isn't a recommendation or a guideline. It's an enforceable duty, and a violation of it is a specific ground for board discipline. The 30-day rule serves a dual purpose. It protects patients who may have conditions requiring medical evaluation beyond the scope of physical therapy, and it reinforces the medical diagnosis prohibition by making sure that patients who aren't responding to physical therapy intervention are directed to providers who can pursue diagnostic avenues unavailable to the physical therapist. Finally, a word on what a referral means. A referral is the written or oral designation of physical therapy services by a doctor of medicine, dentistry, osteopathy, podiatry, or chiropractic, by a physician assistant, or by a nurse practitioner holding a license in good standing. The instruction may be as detailed or as general as the referring provider, in sound discretion, deems necessary. Applying physical therapy other than upon proper referral, except as specifically authorized in Rule 3.1, remains a ground for discipline under Rule 6.1, paragraph 18. Let's close Module 4 by examining the continuing competence requirements. Mississippi licenses are subject to biennial renewal, with the licensure period running July 1st through June 30th. Surnames beginning A through L renew in odd-numbered years. Surnames M through Z renew in even-numbered years. And a licensee's renewal group is fixed at initial licensure and doesn't change even if the licensee's name changes. Each licensee must accrue 30 continuing competence units, abbreviated CCUs, during each 2-year licensing period, with no carryover of units from one period to another. Of the 30 continuing competence units required each licensure period, at least 3 hours must be in ethics, professionalism, or jurisprudence, the very requirement this course is designed to satisfy. At least 25%, or 7.5 units, must be directly related to the clinical practice of physical therapy, and at least 15 of the 30 units must come from certified activities that have passed a formal certification process against required criteria. Certified activities include conferences and activities meeting the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy, standards of continuing competence, activities provided by the APTA or the Mississippi Physical Therapy Association, and other APTA chapters and sections, university coursework, board-approved programs, American Board of Physical Therapy Specialist certification or recertification, and the Federation's practice review tool. Approved activities, which are limited to 15 units, include non-certified courses, self-study, in-service education, presentations, research, publications, clinical instructorship, board or committee work, structured interactive study, and formal mentorship. The regulations specifically exclude certain activities from counting: staff meetings, presentations or publications directed at lay groups, worksite orientation, entertainment and recreational activities, routine teaching or research duties that are part of a job requirement, repetitions of an activity within the same period, and carried over units. Activities for military reservists called to active duty are prorated, but the ethics and professional responsibility requirement can't be prorated. From and after July 1st, 2016, licensees must record and report continuing competence through the Federation's free online APTA program. The board randomly selects licensees for audit each period, and licensees must retain evidence of compliance for the preceding licensure period. Licensees who fail to accrue the required hours may be issued a one-time probationary license for a single period only. Continued failure may result in sanctions up to and including revocation. The continuing competence system thus works as an ongoing accountability mechanism that reinforces the initial licensure requirements and makes sure practitioners maintain the knowledge and skills they need for competent practice throughout their careers. The 3-hour ethics requirement, in particular, reflects the board's recognition that ethical and regulatory knowledge needs regular renewal, a principle consistent with the 2026 APTA Code's Ethical Commitment 8, which makes career-long learning an affirmative ethical obligation. Module 5. Supervision, Delegation, and Documentation Standards. Let's begin with the requirements for supervising physical therapist assistants. Mississippi's Supervision Framework sets up a thorough system of oversight designed to make sure that physical therapist assistants practice within a structure of continuous physical therapist responsibility. The foundational principle is unambiguous. A Mississippi licensed physical therapist may delegate the performance of selected acts, tasks, functions, or interventions to a Mississippi licensed physical therapist assistant, but the physical therapist remains responsible at all times for the plan of care, for the interpretation of referrals, for oversight of all documentation, and for making sure that the physical therapist assistant doesn't function autonomously. This delegation authority isn't a transfer of responsibility. It's an extension of the supervising physical therapist's clinical judgment into a team-based service delivery model, with the physical therapist carrying ultimate accountability for every aspect of the patient's care. The supervision requirements begin before the physical therapist assistant ever treats a patient. The supervising physical therapist must perform the initial evaluation and establish a written plan of care before delegating any tasks. This is an absolute, non-delegable duty. The initial evaluation may never be performed or signed by a physical therapist assistant. Once the plan of care is established, the physical therapist must review the plan of care and the delegated tasks with the assistant before the assistant first treats the patient, making sure the assistant understands the clinical rationale, the specific interventions authorized, and the parameters within which those interventions are to be delivered. The supervising physical therapist must also make sure that assignments fit the assistant's qualifications, training, education, skill level, and experience. When the physical therapist is the direct employer, the physical therapist carries the additional responsibility of verifying that the assistant holds a valid, current Mississippi license. Throughout the course of assistant-delivered care, the supervising physical therapist must be readily available in person or by telecommunication at all times for advice, assistance, and instruction while the assistant is treating patients. This availability requirement makes sure the assistant can obtain immediate clinical guidance whenever patient status changes, unexpected findings emerge, or clinical uncertainty arises. The regulations further require that the physical therapist hold regularly scheduled, documented meetings and case conferences with the assistant, and that these occur at a minimum of every 6th assistant visit or every 30th calendar day, whichever comes first. At those same intervals, the physical therapist must also reevaluate and personally treat the patient. The assistant may never alter a treatment plan without prior physical therapist evaluation and approval. At the conclusion of the episode of care, the physical therapist must treat and assess the patient for the final session, establish the discharge plan, and write the discharge summary. Discharge planning and the discharge summary are non-delegable physical therapist duties, making sure that the responsible practitioner makes the final clinical determinations about the patient's status and subsequent care needs. A distinctive feature of Mississippi's supervisory framework is the numerical supervision ceiling. It's the physical therapist's responsibility to determine how many assistants he or she can supervise safely and competently, but in no case shall a physical therapist supervise more than a total of 4 physical therapist assistants and/or physical therapy students at any point in time during the physical therapist's workday. This 4-assistant ceiling is inclusive of all geographic locations and employing agencies, a critical clarification that keeps a physical therapist from getting around the limit by spreading supervisory responsibilities across multiple clinic sites. The ceiling reflects the board's judgment that effective supervision requires a manageable span of oversight, and that exceeding this limit creates unacceptable risk to patient safety regardless of the supervising therapist's self-assessed capacity. An important regulatory nuance involves the definitions of supervision intervals. The general definitions in Rule 1.3 specify that direct on-site supervision means face-to-face oversight by a licensed physical therapist at regular intervals of services provided to a patient by a physical therapist assistant, with regular intervals defined as every 6th treatment day or 14th calendar day, whichever comes first. The specific assistant supervisory conference and re-evaluation duties in Rule 8.2, though, use a different interval, every 6th assistant visit or every 30th calendar day, whichever comes first. Practitioners have to understand this distinction and comply with both the general supervision definitions and the specific Rule 8.2 re-evaluation requirements. In situations where both provisions apply, the more frequent interval governs. The practical consequence is that physical therapists must track both the general supervision schedule and the Rule 8.2 conference and re-evaluation timeline for each patient receiving assistant-delivered services. Let's now examine physical therapist assistant roles and restrictions. The scope of assistant practice in Mississippi is defined by both affirmative authorizations and express prohibitions. Under Rule 8.1, an assistant practices only under the direct supervision of a Mississippi licensed physical therapist. The assistant assists with, but doesn't perform, patient evaluations, performs delegated treatment procedures but doesn't initiate or alter a treatment plan, may supervise other supportive personnel as charged by the physical therapist, must notify the physical therapist of changes in patient status, must immediately discontinue any procedure that appears harmful, and may refuse to carry out procedures believed not to be in the patient's best interest. The express prohibitions are equally significant. The assistant shall not perform the interpretation of referrals, initial evaluation or screening and re-evaluation, identification, determination, or modification of the plan of care, including goals and treatment programs, final discharge assessment or evaluation, or establishment of the discharge plan, or techniques beyond the assistant's skill and knowledge. These prohibitions draw a clear boundary between the clinical judgment functions reserved to the physical therapist and the treatment implementation functions that may be delegated to the assistant. The prohibition on plan of care modification is particularly important in daily practice, since assistants must recognize when patient responses to treatment indicate a need for plan modification, and communicate those observations to the supervising physical therapist, rather than making adjustments on their own. Research on assistant scope perceptions has found that discrepancies between actual scope limitations and assistant understanding of those limitations most frequently involve evaluation, assessment, and plan of care modification tasks, precisely the non-delegable activities that Mississippi law reserves exclusively to the physical therapist. The assistant's obligation to notify the supervising physical therapist of changes in patient status creates an affirmative reporting duty that complements the physical therapist's supervisory obligations. This notification requirement works as a patient safety mechanism. The assistant, who may be delivering the majority of treatment sessions between physical therapist re-evaluations, serves as the frontline observer of clinical change and must communicate findings that may warrant a modification to the plan of care. The assistant's right to refuse to carry out procedures believed not to be in the patient's best interest reflects the ethical principle that all practitioners, regardless of supervisory status, carry moral responsibility for the safety of the care they deliver, This right is consistent with the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics Ethical Commitment 7, which requires that assistants support and respect the supervisory role while also communicating their limitations and needs to the supervising physical therapist. The relationship between assistant roles under Mississippi law and the 2026 APTA Code's Ethical Commitment 7 deserves particular attention. The code establishes that the physical therapist keeps full responsibility for all physical therapy services and holds primary responsibility for the supervision of physical therapist assistants and support personnel. These ethical provisions are enforceable in Mississippi through Rule 3.4's incorporation by reference mechanism, creating a regulatory framework in which the assistant supervision requirements of state law and the ethical supervision standards of the APTA Code operate as reinforcing systems of accountability. A physical therapist who fails to provide adequate assistant supervision in Mississippi may face discipline both for violating the specific supervisory requirements of Rule 8.2 and for failing to adhere to recognized professional ethical standards under Rule 6.1, paragraph 19. This dual basis for disciplinary action shows how seriously Mississippi treats supervision failures and how complete the accountability framework is that governs the physical therapist-assistant relationship. Let's turn to delegation to aides and support personnel. Mississippi draws a sharp line between the tasks that may be delegated to physical therapist assistants and those that may be delegated to physical therapy aides. A physical therapy aide is defined as a person who performs only simple, mechanical, or machine-assisted acts in the physical care of a patient that don't require the knowledge and skill of a physical therapist. Aides may perform these limited tasks only under the direct on-site supervision of a licensed physical therapist, or under the order or direction of a licensed physician or dentist. The critical boundary falls between simple mechanical acts and skilled physical therapy interventions. Aides may not perform tasks requiring the clinical judgment of a physical therapist, and skilled physical therapy interventions may not be delegated to aides. The practical significance of this distinction lies in figuring out which tasks count as simple mechanical acts versus skilled interventions, setting up a hot pack, positioning a patient on equipment, or performing administrative tasks associated with patient care may fall within the aide's permissible scope when performed under direct on-site supervision. Any task that requires clinical assessment, modification based on patient response, or the exercise of therapeutic judgment, though, crosses the boundary into skilled intervention and may not be delegated to an aide regardless of the level of supervision provided. The requirement for direct on-site supervision of aides means that the supervising physical therapist must be physically present in the facility and available for immediate consultation. Telecommunication availability alone doesn't satisfy the supervision requirement for aide activities. Research on aide utilization has documented that ethical dilemmas related to aide use are common, with a majority of physical therapists wanting more specific guidelines to navigate the boundary between permissible aide tasks and impermissible delegation of skilled interventions. Common delegation violations in physical therapy practice include assigning aides to perform skilled interventions without adequate supervision, allowing aides to exercise clinical judgment about treatment modifications, and failing to maintain the direct on-site supervision requirement. Under Mississippi law, permitting unlicensed persons to perform services requiring a license is a specific ground for discipline under Rule 6.1, paragraph 15, and performing or permitting unacceptable services due to deliberate or negligent acts, regardless of whether actual damage to the public is established, is an additional ground under Rule 6.1, paragraph 6. The regardless of actual damage language matters. A physical therapist who delegates skilled interventions to an aide may face discipline even if no patient harm results, because the violation lies in the improper delegation itself rather than in its consequences. Mississippi also imposes specific supervisory requirements on temporary licensees. A physical therapist holding a temporary license must practice under direct supervision, defined as daily face-to-face communication, on-premises observation a minimum of 2 hours per day, and the availability of the supervisor by telecommunication when off-premises. A temporary licensee may not supervise other licensees, which keeps the supervisory chain of accountability in the hands of fully licensed practitioners. In addition, a licensee whose license has been expired more than 5 years must complete a 3-month supervised period under the direct on-site supervision of a currently licensed Mississippi physical therapist before resuming independent practice. This re-entry requirement reflects the board's recognition that extended absence from practice may erode clinical competency, and that supervised practice provides a structured pathway for restoring skills to current standards. The principle behind both the temporary licensee supervision requirement and the expired license re-entry period is consistent with the 2026 APTA Code's Ethical Commitment 8, which requires practitioners to recognize and practice within the limits of their current skills and competence. Let's now turn to documentation and record-keeping standards. Documentation in physical therapy isn't merely an administrative function. It's the evidentiary foundation of clinical accountability, the legal record of services rendered, and a regulatory requirement whose violation is independent grounds for discipline. Mississippi's documentation requirements are established primarily in Rule 8.2, Paragraph 3, which mandates that a written record of physical therapy treatment be maintained for each patient. The required elements of the patient record are extensive. Each record must contain a prescription or referral, when required, signed by a lawfully authorized healthcare provider. Written documentation with the physical therapist's signature of treatment program goals and the plan of care must be included. And the initial physical therapy evaluation shall not be documented or signed by an assistant or any other personnel. Progress notes must address the patient's subjective status, changes in objective findings, and progression or regression toward goals. A record of reassessment and reevaluation, written and signed by the supervising physical therapist, must document each periodic reevaluation required under the supervisory framework. Documentation of each patient visit, including the specific treatment and services provided, is required. Documentation of supervisory visits and conferences, including the date, the treatment plans and changes, other communications between the physical therapist and assistant, and findings and decisions must be signed and dated by the supervising physical therapist or the assistant. Documentation of a discharge evaluation by the supervising physical therapist and a discharge summary written and signed by the supervising physical therapist are required, with documented explanation if an emergency prevents completion of the discharge evaluation. Finally, accurate patient and client treatment and billing records must be maintained. Signature integrity is a specific regulatory concern. Mississippi regulations expressly prohibit the use of a signature stamp in place of a written signature on physical therapy records. Electronic signatures are acceptable only where established under written policies and procedures that ensure only the author can authenticate his or her own entry. These requirements guard against unauthorized documentation and make sure that the practitioner who signs a record is genuinely attesting to the accuracy and completeness of its contents. In an era of electronic health records and digital signatures, the requirement for authentication policies is especially relevant. A clinic that permits shared login credentials or fails to put adequate electronic signature safeguards in place may expose both the practice and individual practitioners to regulatory liability. The consequences of documentation deficiencies are explicit. Failure to maintain adequate patient records is unprofessional conduct under Rule 6.1, Paragraph 28. The regulations define adequate patient records as legible records containing, at a minimum, sufficient information to identify the patient, an evaluation of objective findings, a diagnosis, a plan of care, a treatment record, and a discharge plan. This definition sets a clear minimum standard below which documentation isn't merely poor, but is a disciplinary violation. Documentation deficiencies are among the most common contributing factors in malpractice claims against physical therapists, and the absence of adequate records undermines both the practitioner's ability to demonstrate compliance with the standard of care and the patient's ability to receive coordinated follow-up care. The 2026 APTA Code of Ethics reinforces these documentation obligations through Standard 6.2, which requires that documentation accurately reflect the provider, nature, and extent of services provided. This standard is enforceable in Mississippi through Rule 3.4's incorporation of the current APTA Code. Standard 6.2 addresses not only the accuracy of clinical documentation, but the truthfulness of billing records, requiring that documentation reflect the services actually rendered rather than services that might generate higher reimbursement. The intersection of Mississippi's documentation rules and the 2026 Code's documentation standards creates a complete framework in which documentation integrity is at once a regulatory requirement under state law and an enforceable ethical obligation under the incorporated APTA Code. The APTA further establishes that clinical documentation is both a professional responsibility and a legal requirement, and that the physical therapist has oversight of all documentation regardless of setting. This oversight responsibility means the supervising physical therapist can't hand off documentation accountability to the assistant or other personnel. Even when the assistant prepares treatment notes, the physical therapist keeps responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, and adequacy of the overall patient record. This principle aligns with Rule 8.2's requirement that the physical therapist maintain oversight of all documentation in the supervisory relationship, and it reinforces the non-delegable nature of the physical therapist's documentation accountability. Module 6. Enforcement, the disciplinary process, and professional negligence. Let's begin with the standards of conduct and the grounds for discipline. Mississippi's disciplinary framework is built on a detailed enumeration of the grounds on which the Mississippi State Board of Physical Therapy may take action against a licensee. Part 3, 103, Rule 6.1, establishes 29 distinct grounds on which the board, upon satisfactory proof, may suspend, revoke, refuse to issue or renew, censure, reprimand, restrict, or limit a license. These grounds implement the disciplinary authority conferred by the Mississippi Code, and they cover virtually every dimension of professional conduct that could compromise patient safety, public trust, or the integrity of the profession. The enumerated grounds fall into several broad categories. Practice-related grounds include negligence in the practice or performance of professional services, performing or permitting unacceptable services due to deliberate or negligent acts, regardless of whether actual damage to the public is established, continued practice while unfit due to failure to keep abreast of current professional practice, due to physical or mental disability, or due to addiction to or severe dependency upon alcohol or drugs that may endanger the public, and treating ailments or health conditions other than by physical therapy as authorized. The regardless of actual damage language in the unacceptable services provision is a critical feature of Mississippi's regulatory approach. The board may discipline a practitioner for negligent acts, even in the absence of demonstrated patient harm, reflecting the regulatory principle that the conduct itself, not merely its consequences, is the subject of disciplinary concern. Ethical and professional conduct grounds include dishonorable, unethical, or unprofessional conduct of a character likely to deceive, defraud, or harm the public, failing to adhere to recognized professional ethical standards of the profession, as established by board rule, revealing confidential information except as required by law, and differential, detrimental treatment based on race, color, creed, sex, religion, or national origin. The ground relating to recognized professional ethical standards, Rule 6.1, paragraph 19, is the provision through which Mississippi's incorporation of the APTA Code of Ethics under Rule 3.4 gains its disciplinary force. A violation of the enforceable standards of conduct in the 2026 Code is a failure to adhere to recognized professional ethical standards, independently supporting board discipline. Sexual misconduct is addressed with particular specificity. Rule 6.1 expressly prohibits soliciting or engaging in sexual relationships, whether consensual or not, while a physical therapist-patient or assistant-patient relationship exists, making sexual advances toward patients, and intentionally viewing a disrobed patient when not related to diagnosis or treatment. The breadth of this provision, covering consensual as well as non-consensual contact, reflects the board's recognition that the power differential built into the therapeutic relationship makes genuinely free consent questionable, even when it appears to be present. Research documents that the overwhelming majority of physical therapy clinicians, more than 4 in 5, have experienced inappropriate patient sexual behavior over their careers, which highlights the boundary challenges inherent in a profession built on physical touch. Cross-professional regulatory data show that sexual relationships with patients are among the most likely of all violations to end in a practitioner being stripped of the right to practice, confirming the severity with which licensing boards treat this category of misconduct. Additional grounds for discipline address a wide range of conduct. These include fraud and deception in obtaining or renewing a license, conviction of a crime substantially related to the licensee's services, or of a felony, disciplinary action against the licensee's license in another jurisdiction, false or misleading advertising, permitting unlicensed persons to perform services requiring a license, charging excessive or unreasonable fees, or engaging in unreasonable collection practices, applying physical therapy other than upon proper referral, except as authorized under the direct access provisions, acting as an assistant other than under the direct on-site supervision of a physical therapist, lewd conduct in connection with professional services, failing to maintain adequate patient records, failing to complete continuing competence requirements, failing to supervise assistants in accordance with the board's rules, and failing to report to the board any unprofessional, incompetent, or illegal acts that appear to violate the law or board rules. The mandatory reporting obligation deserves specific attention. Mississippi law requires practitioners not only to refrain from ethical violations themselves, but to report the violations of others. A physical therapist who becomes aware of unprofessional, incompetent, or illegal acts by a colleague and fails to report those acts to the board is independently subject to discipline. This obligation turns every practitioner into a participant in the regulatory enforcement system, and it addresses the problem of ethical silence, the situation in which ethical values are being challenged, but no one names or discusses the challenge, which is one of the 5 recognized types of ethical situations in physical therapy practice. The convergence of professional ethics standards with licensure law through Rules 3.4 and 6.1, paragraph 19, creates a distinctive enforcement architecture. Title protection provisions round out this framework by making it unlawful for any person or business entity to represent itself as a physical therapist assistant, or a provider of physical therapy services without a valid existing Mississippi license. It's equally unlawful to employ an unlicensed person to provide physical therapy services. Each licensee must prominently display the certificate of licensure at each place of employment, carry the license identification card at all times, and make sure each place of business displays a consumer information sign, measuring at minimum 6 inches by 8 inches, providing the board's contact information for the filing of complaints. These identification and display requirements serve both consumer protection and enforcement functions. They let patients verify practitioner credentials, and they help activate the complaint process through which the disciplinary system is set in motion. Criminal offences related to title protection, including practicing without a license, fraudulently obtaining a license, or impersonating a licensee, are classified as misdemeanors punishable by fine, imprisonment, or both. Let's now walk through the complaint and investigation process. The disciplinary process begins with a complaint. All complaints concerning a licensee, business, or practice are reviewed by the board and logged. Only complaints submitted in writing and signed on the official board complaint form are formally addressed, absent extenuating circumstances. Any person, firm, corporation, board member, or public officer may file a complaint, which keeps the complaint process accessible to patients, employers, colleagues, and institutional observers. Upon receipt, board staff log the date of the complaint, determine whether the subject is a current licensee, assign a complaint number, notify the complaint consultant, and confirm receipt to the complainant. A complaint committee, consisting of the complaint consultant and/or the complaint manager, then reviews the complaint to determine whether it states a possible violation within the board's jurisdiction. If the complaint doesn't state a jurisdictional violation, the committee recommends dismissal. If it does, the respondent generally receives written notice and a copy of the complaint within 30 days and is given 20 days to respond. If the committee determines that disclosure would impair the investigation, though, the investigation may proceed without initial notice to the respondent. This exception to the standard notice provision reflects the reality that in cases involving ongoing patient harm, evidence destruction, or other time-sensitive concerns, alerting the respondent before the investigation is underway could compromise the board's ability to protect the public. The committee may engage experts, consultants, or investigators as needed to evaluate the complaint and develop the factual record. The board retains authority for summary suspension in urgent circumstances. The board may summarily suspend a license without a prior hearing, simultaneously with the filing of a formal complaint and notice of hearing, if it determines that the health, safety, or welfare of the public is in immediate danger, or that the licensee's physical or mental capacity to practice is at issue. This emergency power is subject to a temporal safeguard. When a license is summarily suspended, a hearing must begin within 20 days unless continued at the licensee's request. The summary suspension provision balances the board's duty to protect the public with the licensee's due process rights by making sure that the deprivation of the license, while immediate, is promptly followed by an opportunity to be heard. Summary suspension is reserved for situations of acute risk. It isn't a routine step in the disciplinary process, but an extraordinary measure triggered by imminent public danger. Let's examine administrative hearings and sanctions. Every licensee or applicant is afforded notice and an opportunity for a hearing before the board acts to deny, refuse to renew, suspend, or revoke a license, with the exception of denials based solely on examination, failure, or administrative requirements. Hearings are conducted by the board or by a designated hearing officer, and each hearing is recorded by a court reporter with transcription costs borne by the requesting party. No more than 2 continuances are granted without board approval for good cause. A structural safeguard protects against prejudgment. Complaint committee members who participate in preparing recommendations are recused from further action against the respondent, making sure that the adjudicating body approaches the hearing without prior involvement in the investigative process. This recusal provision puts a fundamental due process principle into practice, the separation of investigative and adjudicative functions, and it reinforces the fairness of the disciplinary hearing process. The board may also resolve matters through informal proceedings, settlement, consent orders, or voluntary surrender of license, providing flexibility to address violations through means short of a formal hearing when appropriate. The board's sanction authority provides a graduated range of disciplinary responses, calibrated to the severity of the violation. Upon finding a violation of the Mississippi Code or Rule 6.1, the board may impose, singly or in combination, any of the following sanctions: revocation of the license, suspension of the license for any period, censure of the licensee, imposition of a monetary penalty not to exceed $500 for the first violation, $1,000 for the second violation, and $5,000 for the third and each subsequent violation. Placement of the licensee on probation with conditions such as regular reporting, continued education, or other reasonable requirements. Refusal to issue or renew a license. Revocation of probation and imposition of other discipline when probation terms are violated. Restriction of a license. Acceptance of a voluntary surrender based on a consent order. Issuance of an advisory letter when information doesn't merit formal discipline. and assessment and levy of the costs of investigation and prosecution, including process service, court reporters, expert witnesses, investigators, and attorney fees against the licensee. The sanction range spans from the least severe measure, an advisory letter, issued when information doesn't merit formal discipline, through the most severe license revocation, which terminates the practitioner's legal authorization to practice physical therapy in Mississippi. Between these poles, the board has extensive discretion to fashion remedies that address the specific circumstances of each case. Probation with conditions lets the board maintain oversight while permitting continued practice, a disposition particularly suited to cases where the violation reflects a correctable deficiency rather than a fundamental unfitness to practice. The monetary penalty escalation structure, $500, $1,000, $5,000, reflects a progressive discipline philosophy in which first-time violations are met with lower financial penalties, while repeat violations trigger substantially greater consequences. The board's authority to assess investigation and prosecution costs against the licensee adds a significant financial dimension beyond the monetary penalty itself, since the costs of engaging experts, investigators, and legal counsel in complex disciplinary proceedings may substantially exceed the penalty amounts. Any person aggrieved by a board decision has a right of appeal as provided in the Act and in Mississippi law. The board publishes final disciplinary actions at least annually and reports them to other state, federal, and national disciplinary databases. This publication and reporting requirement ensures transparency and lets other jurisdictions access Mississippi disciplinary information when evaluating applicants for licensure or compact privilege. The public nature of final disciplinary actions serves an additional deterrent function. Practitioners who know that disciplinary outcomes will be published and shared across jurisdictions may be more attentive to compliance with the board's standards than they would be under a confidential disciplinary system. Let's close Module 6 with professional negligence and malpractice. Professional negligence, malpractice represents the intersection of clinical practice standards, legal liability, and regulatory accountability. Malpractice is defined as the failure to provide the degree of care required of a professional under the standards and scope of the license, resulting in harm. 4 elements must be established to prove physical therapy malpractice. The first is duty, meaning the physical therapist had a professional responsibility to the patient as defined by the state's scope of practice and standards of care. The second is breach, meaning the physical therapist deviated from the accepted standard of care through action or failure to act. The third is causation, meaning the breach directly caused or contributed to the patient's injury. And the fourth is harm, meaning the patient suffered actual injury, whether physical, emotional, or financial. Mississippi's disciplinary framework adds a significant overlay on the traditional civil malpractice framework. Negligence is an independent ground for board discipline under Rule 6.1, Paragraph 1, which lists negligence in the practice or performance of professional services as a disciplinary ground. Rule 6.1, Paragraph 6 extends this reach further, covering deliberate or negligent acts or failures to act that permit unacceptable services, regardless of whether actual damage or damages to the public are established. This provision means the board may discipline negligent practice even where a civil plaintiff couldn't prove the damages element required for a malpractice judgment, a key distinction between regulatory accountability and civil malpractice liability. A practitioner who delivers substandard care may escape civil liability if no demonstrable patient harm results. But the same practitioner may face board discipline because the regulatory standard focuses on the quality of the conduct itself rather than on its consequences. The leading allegations in malpractice claims against physical therapists include improper management over the course of treatment, which is the most frequently alleged basis for claims, inappropriate professional behavior, and fraudulent billing. Recurring fact patterns include burn and equipment-related injuries from therapeutic modalities, patient falls during treatment, and injuries arising from exercise and manual therapy interventions. Documentation deficiencies are a common contributing factor in malpractice claims, since inadequate records undermine the practitioner's ability to demonstrate that the care provided met the applicable standard. The significance of documentation in malpractice defense reinforces the regulatory framework examined earlier in this module. Documentation is at once a clinical best practice, a regulatory requirement, and a legal safeguard against liability. The distinction between legal authority, standard of care, and clinical competency is essential for understanding Mississippi's approach to professional accountability. Mississippi regulation establishes legal minimums for practice through the practice law and board rules, but clinical competence requires education, training, and demonstrated ability beyond those legal minimums. A physical therapist may be legally authorized to perform a technique, yet still be negligent if the therapist lacks the competence to perform it safely. This principle is made explicit in the dry needling competency rule, Rule 3.3, paragraph C, which requires 50 hours of instruction and documented competency before a licensee may perform intramuscular dry needling, even though the technique falls within the statutory scope of physical therapy practice. The continuing competence philosophy in Rule 5.1 reinforces this distinction by charging each licensee with accountability to the consumer, the employer, and the profession for maintaining high levels of skill and knowledge throughout the career. The practical implication is that a Mississippi practitioner who encounters an unfamiliar technique or technology can't lean on the breadth of the statutory scope of practice as a defense against a negligence claim. The practitioner must also demonstrate the specific competency needed to perform the technique safely and effectively. Risk management and proactive compliance are the practitioner's primary defenses against both disciplinary action and civil liability. The physical therapy ethics literature consistently identifies several protective factors: maintaining thorough and contemporaneous documentation, practicing within the boundaries of demonstrated competency rather than merely legal authority, engaging in regular peer review and continuing professional development, and cultivating an ethical practice environment in which concerns can be raised without fear of retaliation. The 2026 APTA Code's Ethical Commitment 8, which makes career-long learning and technology competence affirmative ethical obligations, provides the professional standards framework within which these risk management practices sit. For Mississippi practitioners, the convergence of state regulatory requirements, APTA ethical standards incorporated by reference, and civil liability principles creates a multi-layered accountability system, in which diligent compliance with any one layer reinforces compliance with the others, and in which deficiencies in any one area may expose the practitioner to consequences across all three. Module 7, Contemporary Practice Challenges, Telehealth, Artificial Intelligence, Mandated Reporting, and Emerging Issues. Module 7 turns to the contemporary challenges that increasingly shape everyday practice, beginning with informed consent. Informed consent is the right of the patient, or an authorized representative, to either pursue or refuse physical therapy in whole or in part following the reasonable disclosure of information. The Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy's 2025 Informed Consent Guide for Physical Therapy identifies the required disclosures as the nature, benefits, and risks of the proposed treatment, the alternatives to care, the risks of refusing treatment, and the identity and qualifications of the provider or providers. Informed consent isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing obligation throughout the episode of care, and the patient always keeps the right to consent to or refuse care at any point. The concept of capacity to consent covers 4 dimensions. The first is understanding, defined as comprehending the disclosed information. The second is appreciation, applying that information to one's own situation. The third is reasoning, weighing the information logically. And the fourth is communication, expressing a decision clearly. When a patient lacks one or more of these capacities, consent must be obtained from a legally authorized representative or surrogate. Physical therapists assess decisional capacity for the purpose of care. They don't make legal determinations of competence, which is a judicial function. Mississippi regulation requires written informed consent in two specific high-risk or technology-mediated contexts. First, Rule 3.2 requires written informed consent before services are provided through telehealth, documenting the patient's acknowledgement of the risks, limitations, and benefits of electronic delivery, including the potential for breach of confidentiality and the possibility of session recording. Second, Rule 3.3, paragraph F, requires that a physical therapist performing intramuscular dry needling obtain written informed consent for each patient. The patient must sign and receive a copy of the consent form, which must at minimum state the risks and benefits of dry needling, the physical therapist's level of education and training in the technique, and that the physical therapist will not stimulate distal or auricular points. These written consent requirements add to the general informed consent obligation. They don't replace it. Mississippi practitioners must obtain informed consent for all physical therapy services, with the two specific contexts above requiring the additional safeguard of written documentation. The 2026 APTA Code of Ethics reinforces the informed consent framework through Standard of Conduct 2.2, which requires physical therapists and physical therapist assistants to obtain ongoing informed consent after providing understandable, honest, and necessary information to allow the patient, client, or their surrogate to make informed decisions about participation in physical therapist services or research. Because Mississippi incorporates the APTA code by reference through Rule 3.4, the ongoing consent obligation in Standard 2.2 is enforceable in Mississippi alongside the specific written consent requirements described above. The convergence of the Federation Framework, Mississippi Regulation, and the 2026 APTA Code creates a complete informed consent structure in which the physical therapist's obligation extends from the initial disclosure through every subsequent clinical encounter. Let's turn to telehealth compliance. Mississippi expressly recognizes telehealth as an appropriate model of physical therapy service delivery when provided consistent with the standards of practice, the ethical principles, and the rules for Mississippi practitioners. The operational requirements are established in Part 3, 103, Rule 3.2, which applies to both physical therapists and physical therapist assistants delivering services by telehealth, designated telephysical therapy in the regulation. Upon initial contact with the patient, the licensee using telehealth must verify the identity of the patient prior to each session, obtain alternative means of contacting the patient, and provide the patient with alternative means of contacting the licensee. Provide contact methods for emergency purposes. Use personal identifying information only in secure communications, and obtain written, informed consent from the patient or an authorized decision-maker before services are provided through telehealth. The telehealth informed consent must at minimum inform the patient and document acknowledgement of the risks, limitations, and potential benefits associated with the use of electronic communications in physical therapy, the potential breach of confidentiality or inadvertent access to protected health information, the potential disruption of electronic communication, and the possible recording of treatment sessions. The licensee must ensure that electronic communication is secure in order to maintain the confidentiality of the patient's medical information as required by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA, and other applicable federal and state laws, including the secure disposal of electronic equipment and data. This requirement puts into practice the confidentiality obligations established by Rule 6.1, Paragraph 14, which makes revealing confidential information, except as required by law, a ground for discipline, and it aligns with the HIPAA privacy rules requirements for the protection of protected health information. A licensee delivering telephysical therapy must determine and document that telehealth is appropriate for the patient, limit practice to areas of demonstrated competence, make every attempt to ensure that an on-site physical therapist or physical therapist assistant provides appropriate in-person interventions when needed, and assure the technological proficiency of those involved in care. Critically, the regulation requires that all evaluations, including initial evaluations, re-evaluations, and scheduled discharges, be performed using a secure video and voice mode or in person. This provision makes sure that the clinical judgment functions reserved to the physical therapist under the supervisory framework are performed through communication modes that allow real-time visual and auditory assessment of the patient, preserving the evaluative rigor that in-person encounters provide. The licensee must document which services were provided by Telehealth and follow the record-keeping requirements of Rule 8.2. The APTA's 2024 Clinical Practice Guideline on Telerehabilitation provides evidence-based support for telehealth service delivery, with findings that telerehabilitation is at least equivalent to in-person physical therapy for patient acceptability and satisfaction, and superior for treatment adherence and attendance. A telephysical therapy practitioner must hold an active Mississippi license in good standing, or otherwise be authorized in the jurisdiction where the patient is located, including through the Physical Therapy Licensure Compact, must abide by Mississippi standards of care, and must comply with all applicable state and federal laws. Let's now examine mandated reporting. Mississippi law imposes mandatory reporting obligations on physical therapists across three principal statutory mandates: child abuse and neglect, vulnerable adult abuse, and sex crimes against minors. These obligations arise from Mississippi's general protective statutes and apply to physical therapists in the course of their professional duties, independent of the physical therapy practice law. Compliance with mandatory reporter laws is also an enforceable standard under the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics, Ethical Commitment to Integrity, which requires practitioners to fulfill their legal and ethical obligations, including mandatory reporting. Under the Child Abuse and Neglect Statute, any person having reasonable cause to suspect that a child is a neglected or abused child shall cause an oral report to be made immediately by telephone or otherwise, followed as soon as possible by a written report to the Mississippi Department of Child Protection Services. Because the statute reaches any other person beyond the specific professional categories it names, physical therapists are squarely covered. The threshold is reasonable cause to suspect, not certainty, and willful failure to report is punishable by a fine not to exceed $5,000, imprisonment not to exceed 1 year, or both. Under the Vulnerable Persons Act, health and mental health professionals engaged in the examination, care, or treatment of vulnerable persons who have reasonable cause to believe that a vulnerable person has been or is being abused, neglected, or exploited must report to the Mississippi Department of Human Services Adult Protective Services. A vulnerable person is defined as any person 18 or older who, because of mental or physical dysfunction, can't protect themselves from abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Licensed professionals, including physical therapists, who hold licenses under Title 73 must include their name, address, and telephone number in the report. Mississippi's mandatory reporting statute for sex crimes against minors expressly lists physical therapist within its definition of mandatory reporter. This makes physical therapists named mandatory reporters by statute for enumerated sexual offenses against minors, an obligation that applies to Mississippi physical therapists by name rather than by inference from a general category. Physical therapists should recognize that this naming carries particular significance. The legislature specifically identified the profession as holding a position of trust and access that warrants explicit inclusion in the statutory mandate. Mandated reporters are required to report, not to investigate. Reporters who act in good faith are generally afforded immunity from civil and criminal liability, even if the report turns out to be unsubstantiated. The physician-patient privilege and analogous privileges don't bar testimony regarding a child's injuries in proceedings resulting from a child abuse report. HIPAA explicitly permits disclosure of protected health information for mandated reporting without patient consent, and the minimum necessary provision doesn't apply to disclosures required by law. This alignment between HIPAA and state mandatory reporting law means that a physical therapist who reports suspected abuse isn't violating the confidentiality obligations of Rule 6.1, paragraph 14. The disclosure is required by law and is therefore exempt from both the state disciplinary ground and the federal privacy restriction. The evidence base highlights why mandated reporting awareness matters so much in physical therapy. Research has found that across health professions, clinicians recognize likely child physical abuse in a substantial share of the cases they see, often a majority of them, yet they go on to formally report it far less often, sometimes in only a small minority of the cases they have already recognized, a significant gap between seeing the problem and acting on it. A survey of outpatient physical therapists found that nearly half reported having treated a patient they identified or strongly suspected as battered, yet almost none routinely asked their patients about physical abuse, and fewer than half correctly identified the central pattern of battering injuries. Persons with disabilities experience violence at roughly 4 times the rate of persons without disabilities, and more than 1 in 10 older adults have experienced abuse over their lifetimes. These data confirm that physical therapists serve patient populations with elevated vulnerability and meet abuse indicators with regularity, making strong awareness of reporting obligations essential to ethical and legal practice. Let's turn to the emerging issues of artificial intelligence, social media, and health equity. The 2026 Code of Ethics for the Physical Therapy Profession explicitly addresses emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, throughout its standards of conduct and its aspirational illustrative examples. 3 provisions are particularly relevant. Standard 3D requires physical therapists and physical therapist assistants to be accountable for the accuracy and truthfulness of the information they disseminate, including in the use of emerging technologies such as social media and artificial intelligence. Standard 5C requires practitioners to recognize the public trust placed in them and to maintain professional responsibility when information is disseminated using current and emerging technologies. And Standard 8A requires practitioners to develop and maintain competence and to exercise appropriate care in using current and emerging technologies, including social media and artificial intelligence. The inclusion of artificial intelligence throughout the code was a deliberate modernization effort designed to help practitioners navigate ethical decisions in the era of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. The profession faces real challenges in putting these standards into practice. A cross-sectional study of physical therapists found that roughly 2/3 reported no experience at all with artificial intelligence applications in their work. Their leading concerns were the privacy and security of patient data and the cost and resource barriers to adopting these tools, each named by a substantial share of respondents. No physical therapy-specific artificial intelligence governance framework and no APTA position statement on artificial intelligence currently exists. Research has identified 3 specific artificial intelligence-related risks. The first is de-skilling, the loss of acquired clinical skills through over-reliance on artificial intelligence. The second is never-skilling, the failure to develop competencies in areas that artificial intelligence automates during training. And the third is misskilling, the reinforcement of incorrect behavior due to artificial intelligence errors or bias. A study of clinicians showed that participants were roughly 10 times more likely to make the correct decision when the artificial intelligence recommendation was itself correct, a striking illustration of automation bias, the tendency to defer to algorithmic output even when independent clinical judgment should prevail. A 2026 survey found that well over half of clinicians expressed concern about the de-skilling of trainees, and about 2/3 expressed concern about automation bias itself. For Mississippi practitioners, these risks are compounded by the regulatory consequences. A physical therapist who uses an artificial intelligence tool to generate clinical documentation and fails to verify its accuracy may violate the documentation integrity requirements of Rule 6.1, paragraph 28. The truthfulness obligations of the 2026 Code's Standard 6.2 and the competency requirements of Rules 3.3, Paragraph C, and 5.1. Social media and digital communication bring additional ethical challenges. A scoping review of 88 studies on e-professionalism identified 5 specific dangers: the loosening of accountability, the compromising of confidentiality, blurred professional boundaries, the depiction of unprofessional behavior, and legal and disciplinary consequences. Research has documented that patient names appear outright in only a small fraction of healthcare-related social media posts by clinicians, but non-traditional identifiers, the kind of detail sufficient for a family member or friend to recognize who is being described, appear in nearly 1/3 of posts. A cross-sectional survey of physiotherapy students found that more than 3/4 followed at least one physical therapy influencer, nearly half had purchased a product those influencers endorsed, and a clear majority expressed high trust in them, even though a similar majority acknowledged that these influencers carry commercial bias. Under the 2026 Code, practitioners who disseminate clinical information via social media carry the same accountability obligations as they would in any other professional communication. The medium doesn't reduce the responsibility. Health equity is both an ethical imperative and a professional obligation under the 2026 Code's Ethical Commitment 9, Societal Responsibility. A systematic review pooling 36 studies and millions of patients across 8 countries found that white, non-Hispanic patients were consistently more likely than others to use physical therapy at all. A large electronic health record cohort study found that Black patients were substantially less likely than white patients to receive physical therapy within 90 days of a musculoskeletal pain diagnosis, with white patients well over half again as likely to get that care. Geographic disparities compound racial inequities. Rural residents with severe chronic back pain were roughly 1/3 less likely to use physical therapy than residents of large central metropolitan areas. Workforce diversity data revealed that Black and Hispanic practitioners were each markedly underrepresented in the physical therapy workforce in 2019, together making up only a small share of the profession, despite accounting for a far larger share of the working-age population. For Mississippi practitioners serving diverse communities across a state with significant rural populations, these disparities aren't abstract statistics, but clinical realities that bear directly on the justice and equity principles examined in Module 1. Financial ethics and billing integrity round out the contemporary challenges facing Mississippi practitioners. Several grounds for discipline under Rule 6.1 directly address financial conduct, including charging excessive or unreasonable fees, engaging in unreasonable collection practices, and false or misleading advertising. The 2026 Code's Ethical Commitment 6 requires truthful and accurate billing, documentation that reflects services actually rendered, the disclosure of conflicts of interest, and the disclosure of financial interests in recommended products. Because Mississippi incorporates the APTA code by reference, these billing integrity standards carry the force of Mississippi law. The federal anti-kickback statute imposes federal criminal penalties, including fines up to $100,000 and imprisonment up to 10 years, for knowingly and willfully soliciting or receiving remuneration in return for referrals. Dry needling serves as a textbook case study in the intersection of ethics and competency requirements, and it brings Module 7 to a close. The intervention is within the statutory scope of physical therapy practice in Mississippi, but performing it requires documented competency, a minimum of 50 hours of face-to-face instruction, board-approved credentials on file, written informed consent for each patient, and a septic technique compliant with Centers for Disease Control and Prevention standards. Online study isn't acceptable training. During the 12-month certification process, a physical therapist may practice skills already learned but may not seek compensation or bill for dry needling until the full 50 hours are completed. Dry needling shall not be delegated and must be directly performed by a qualified licensed physical therapist. The dry needling framework illustrates the principle that legal authority and documented competency are distinct requirements. Performing an act within scope without the prescribed training turns a lawful technique into both a regulatory violation and an ethical breach of non-maleficence and accountability. Module 8, Case Studies in Mississippi, Physical Therapy, Ethics, and Jurisprudence. Each of the following case studies presents a realistic Mississippi practice scenario that asks you to integrate ethical theory, APTA professional standards, the RIPS model of ethical decision-making, and Mississippi law. The case studies are designed to show the practical application of the concepts examined throughout this course to clinical situations that Mississippi physical therapists and physical therapist assistants may encounter in their practice. Case Study 1, Direct Access and the 30-Day Rule. A Mississippi physical therapist holding a Doctor of Physical Therapy degree begins treating a self-referred 52-year-old patient presenting with persistent low back pain. The patient, who hasn't seen a physician for this complaint, presents with diffuse lumbar pain without neurological deficits. The physical therapist performs a thorough evaluation, establishes a physical therapy diagnosis of movement system impairment, and initiates a plan of care including therapeutic exercise, manual therapy, and patient education. By day 28, the patient reports some subjective improvement in pain, but objective functional outcome measures show no measurable change from baseline. The physical therapist faces an intersection of ethical and legal obligations. Under Mississippi's direct access provisions, the physical therapist was authorized to evaluate and treat this patient without referral, because the Doctor of Physical Therapy credential satisfies the treatment credential gate. The 30-day mandatory referral rule, however, requires referral to an appropriate healthcare provider if the patient hasn't made measurable or functional improvement after 30 calendar days of treatment provided under direct access authority. The medical diagnosis prohibition prevents the physical therapist from diagnosing disease. The physical therapist may establish a physical therapy diagnosis, but may not diagnose the underlying medical condition causing the persistent pain. A RIPS analysis classifies this situation as operating in the individual realm, with the ethical situation presenting as a dilemma between the desire to continue treatment that may still benefit the patient and the legal obligation to refer. The individual process requires moral sensitivity to recognize that subjective improvement doesn't satisfy the regulatory threshold of measurable or functional improvement, moral judgment to weigh the competing considerations, and moral courage to refer despite the patient's expressed preference to continue treatment without seeing a physician. The rules-based approach is controlling. Mississippi law makes referral mandatory, not discretionary, and expressly authorizes board discipline against any physical therapist who fails to comply. The ethical resolution requires the physical therapist to make the referral, document the clinical reasoning, and communicate the rationale transparently to the patient, honoring both the legal mandate and the principles of veracity and fidelity. Case Study 2, Physical Therapist Assistant Supervision in a Multi-Site Practice. A supervising physical therapist in a Mississippi outpatient network oversees 3 physical therapist assistants across 2 clinic locations. The practice administrator issues a productivity directive requiring each therapist to increase daily patient volume by 15%, which the supervising physical therapist calculates would require extending assistant re-evaluation intervals beyond the 30-day maximum established by Rule 8.2. The physical therapist currently conducts re-evaluations at every 6th assistant visit or every 30th calendar day, whichever comes first, as required by regulation. The proposed productivity increase would also push the physical therapist's supervisory span to the maximum of 4 assistants and students, at the ceiling permitted by Mississippi law. A RIPS analysis identifies the situation as operating at once in the individual realm, where patients will receive delayed re-evaluations, and the organizational realm, where institutional policy directly conflicts with regulatory requirements.
The ethical situation is distress. The physical therapist knows the right action, maintaining the mandated supervision intervals, but faces organizational pressure to compromise. The individual process requires moral motivation to prioritize regulatory compliance over institutional demands and moral courage to resist the productivity directive.
Extending re-evaluation intervals would violate Rule 8.2 and would be a specific ground for discipline under Rule 6.1 for failing to supervise assistants in accordance with board rules. The 2026 Code's Ethical Commitment 6 further prohibits entering into employment arrangements that prevent the fulfillment of ethical obligations. The resolution requires the physical therapist to communicate the regulatory constraints to the administrator in writing, document the specific provisions that would be violated, and refuse to implement changes that would compromise the mandated supervisory intervals, recognizing that the duty to patients and the legal obligation to the board supersede institutional productivity targets.
Case Study 3: Telehealth Informed Consent and Confidentiality. A Mississippi physical therapist providing telehealth services to a rural patient who is conducting sessions from home notices that during the second video session, an adult family member is visible and audible in the background, occasionally commenting on the patient's symptoms and treatment progress. The patient appears unbothered by the family member's presence and doesn't ask the person to leave. The physical therapist has obtained written informed consent for telehealth as required by Rule 3.2, and the consent form addressed the risks of confidentiality breach, but the current situation presents an active, ongoing confidentiality concern.
This situation operates in the individual realm as an ethical issue involving patient autonomy, confidentiality, and the physical therapist's duty under HIPAA and Mississippi law. The physical therapist must weigh the patient's apparent comfort with the family member's presence against the obligation to protect confidential health information. Under Rule 6.1, Paragraph 14, revealing confidential information is a ground for discipline, and conducting clinical sessions within the hearing of a third party without explicit patient consent to that disclosure creates a confidentiality risk. The Federation's 2025 Informed Consent Guide establishes that consent is ongoing, and the original written consent for telehealth doesn't constitute consent to share clinical information with a family member. The resolution requires the physical therapist to pause the clinical discussion, address the confidentiality concern directly with the patient, explain that clinical information shared during the session is protected, and ask the patient whether they wish to continue the session with the family member present or would prefer privacy. If the patient affirmatively consents to the family member's presence, the therapist should document the patient's informed decision. If the patient declines to ask the family member to leave, but doesn't affirmatively consent to disclosure, the therapist must consider whether the session can proceed without compromising protected information. Case Study 4: Mandatory Reporting of Suspected Elder Abuse. A Mississippi physical therapist providing home health services to a 78-year-old patient recovering from a hip fracture arrives for a scheduled session and observes that the patient appears more disheveled than in previous visits, has lost noticeable weight, and has what appear to be grip pattern bruises on both forearms. The patient's primary caregiver, who is the patient's adult child, is present during the session and becomes agitated when the therapist asks about the bruises, insisting that the patient falls all the time. The patient, who shows signs of cognitive decline, doesn't respond clearly to the therapist's questions about how the bruises occurred. The physical therapist has a reasonable cause to believe that a vulnerable person may be experiencing abuse or neglect. The patient meets the definition of a vulnerable person under Mississippi law, a person 18 or older who, because of mental or physical dysfunction, can't protect themselves from abuse, neglect, or exploitation. The physical therapist's mandatory reporting obligation under the Vulnerable Persons Act is triggered by reasonable cause to believe, not by certainty or confirmed evidence.
The RIPS analysis identifies this as an ethical distress situation. The physical therapist knows the right action, reporting to adult protective services, but may face barriers including concern about damaging the therapeutic relationship, uncertainty about the interpretation of the injuries, and emotional discomfort with the reporting process. The individual process requires moral courage to act on the reporting obligation despite these barriers. The physical therapist is required to report, not to investigate, and good faith reporters are afforded immunity from civil and criminal liability. HIPAA permits disclosure for mandated reporting without patient consent. The confidentiality exception under Mississippi law means that this disclosure isn't a violation of Rule 6.1, paragraph 14, but a legal requirement that supersedes the general confidentiality obligation. The report must include the physical therapist's name, address, and telephone number as required for licensed professionals under the statute. Case Study 5: Dry needling competency and delegation pressure. A Mississippi physical therapist with 2 years of clinical experience has completed 30 hours of a 50-hour face-to-face dry needling course. The clinic owner, who is also a physical therapist, asks the therapist to begin billing patients for dry needling services, arguing that 30 hours is more than most states require. The clinic owner also asks whether the practice's experienced physical therapist assistant could assist with the dry needling procedure to increase patient throughput. Mississippi regulation is unambiguous on both points. A physical therapist must complete a minimum of 50 hours of face-to-face course study and have board-approved credentials on file before billing for dry needling services. During the 12-month certification process, the physical therapist may practice skills already learned but shall not seek compensation or bill for dry needling until the full 50 hours are completed. Dry needling shall not be delegated and must be directly performed by a qualified licensed physical therapist. It can't be delegated to an assistant or aide under any circumstances. Online study isn't acceptable training. The RIPS analysis classifies this situation as ethical temptation. The physical therapist knows the right action, but could benefit financially from billing before completing the training requirements. The organizational realm is also engaged, since the pressure comes from the employer clinic owner. Billing for dry needling without completed credentials would violate Rule 3.3, constituting prima facie evidence that the therapist isn't competent and isn't permitted to perform the technique. It would also violate Rule 6.1 grounds related to fraud and deception, practicing beyond competency and billing integrity. Permitting assistant delegation of dry needling would violate the express non-delegation provision of Rule 3.3 and would constitute permitting unlicensed persons to perform services requiring specific credentialing under Rule 6.1, paragraph 15. The 2026 Code's ethical commitments. 3. Accountability, and 6. Responsible business practices require the therapist to refuse both requests and, if the clinic owner persists, to consider reporting the owner's conduct to the board under the mandatory colleague reporting obligation. Case Study 6: The 2026 Code of Ethics and AI-Assisted Documentation. A Mississippi physical therapist uses an artificial intelligence-powered documentation tool to generate clinical notes from recorded session summaries. During a routine review, the therapist discovers that the artificial intelligence tool has inserted specific assessment findings, including a goniometric range of motion measurement and a manual muscle testing grade that weren't performed during the session. The fabricated findings are clinically plausible and consistent with the patient's presentation, and the therapist considers whether the records could be left as generated, since they seem about right. This scenario directly engages the 2026 Code's technology provisions. Standard 3D requires accountability for the accuracy and truthfulness of information disseminated using emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence. Standard 5C requires maintaining professional responsibility when using artificial intelligence.
Standard 8A requires developing competence in using artificial intelligence and exercising appropriate care. Failing to correct the fabricated findings would violate the documentation integrity requirements of Rule 6.1, paragraph 28, which makes failure to maintain adequate patient records unprofessional conduct and would violate the truthful documentation standard of the 2026 Code's Ethical Commitment 5. Because the artificial intelligence-generated findings weren't actually measured, they constitute false documentation, a violation of the veracity principle, and a potential basis for both billing fraud and malpractice liability if treatment decisions are based on inaccurate data. The RIPS analysis classifies this as ethical temptation. The therapist knows the documentation is inaccurate, but accepting the artificial intelligence output would save time and avoid the need to schedule a follow-up measurement. The individual process requires moral motivation to prioritize documentation integrity over convenience. The rules-based approach is dispositive. Mississippi law requires accurate documentation. The 2026 Code requires truthful records, and the physical therapist keeps full responsibility for all clinical documentation, regardless of the tools used to generate it. The resolution requires the physical therapist to delete the fabricated findings, document only the assessments actually performed, and implement a verification protocol for all artificial intelligence-generated documentation, recognizing that the artificial intelligence tool is an assistive technology, not a substitute for clinical judgment and professional accountability. This concludes the course on ethics and jurisprudence for Mississippi physical therapists and physical therapist assistants. Throughout these modules, you've examined the ethical theories and bioethical principles that ground the profession, the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics and its 9 ethical commitments, the RIPS model of ethical decision-making, and the Mississippi-specific regulatory framework governing licensure, scope of practice, supervision, documentation, enforcement, and contemporary practice challenges. The case studies have shown how these strands come together in real clinical situations. Carrying this integrated understanding into daily practice is the foundation of competent, lawful, and ethical physical therapy in Mississippi. Thank you for completing this course. We will now review the exam questions to solidify your understanding. Question 1. According to the course, which set lists the 6 bioethical principles recognized by the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics as the foundation of ethical physical therapy practice, the correct answer is C. Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, veracity, and fidelity, rationale. The course identifies 6 foundational bioethical principles. The first 4, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, make up the classic Beauchamp-Childress framework, and the APTA adds veracity and fidelity as distinct pillars to recognize honesty and faithfulness to professional commitments. Question 2. What distinguishes the 2026 APTA Code of Ethics for the physical therapy profession from prior versions of the profession's ethics documents? The correct answer is A. For the first time, it merges the separate physical therapist code and physical therapist assistant standards into one unified document. Rationale. The 2026 Code, effective January 1st, 2026, combines the former separate code for the physical therapist and the standards of ethical conduct for the physical therapist assistant into a single document for the first time in the profession's history. It still retains both enforceable standards and aspirational examples, and it continues to rest on 6 foundational principles. Question 3. Which of the 9 ethical commitments in the 2026 Code is entirely aspirational, containing no enforceable standards of conduct? The correct answer is D. Ethical Commitment 9, Societal Responsibility. Rationale. Ethical Commitment. 9. Societal responsibility is entirely aspirational and contains no enforceable standards of conduct. Its illustrative examples include addressing social determinants of health and providing pro bono services. Commitments 2, 5, and 7
Each include enforceable standards of conduct, so they are not entirely aspirational. Question 4. The individual process dimension of the RIPS model draws on James Rest's four-component model of moral behavior. Which set correctly names those four components? The correct answer is B. Moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral courage. Rationale. The individual process dimension uses Rest's four components. Moral sensitivity is recognizing that an ethical issue exists. Moral judgment is determining the right course of action. Moral motivation is prioritizing ethical values over competing interests. And moral courage is acting on the decision despite obstacles. Question 5. Under Mississippi's direct access provisions, a physical therapist may initiate treatment without a prescription or referral only if the physical therapist meets which credential requirement? The correct answer is D. Holds a Doctor of Physical Therapy degree or has 5 years of licensed clinical practice experience. Rationale. Mississippi law allows treatment with or without a referral only if the physical therapist holds a Doctor of Physical Therapy degree from an accredited institution or has 5 years of licensed clinical practice experience. A newly licensed therapist with a master's degree must wait until accumulating 5 years of experience before providing direct access treatment. Question 6. Which statement reflects the single most important bright line scope limitation on Mississippi physical therapists under Rule 3.1? The correct answer is A. No physical therapist shall render a medical diagnosis of a disease. Rationale. The single most important bright line scope limitation in Mississippi is that no physical therapist shall render a medical diagnosis of a disease. This is the foundational boundary distinguishing physical therapy from the practice of medicine. A physical therapist may establish a physical therapy diagnosis, but may not diagnose disease. Question 7. What is the maximum number of physical therapist assistants and/or physical therapy students a Mississippi physical therapist may supervise at any one time during the workday? The correct answer is C4, inclusive of all geographic locations and employing agencies. Rationale. Mississippi law sets a numerical ceiling. In no case shall a physical therapist supervise more than a total of 4 physical therapist assistants and/or physical therapy students at any one time during the workday. This ceiling is inclusive of all geographic locations and employing agencies, so a therapist cannot get around it by spreading supervision across multiple sites. Question 8. Several Mississippi grounds for discipline, such as performing or permitting unacceptable services through negligent acts, apply regardless of whether actual damage to the public is established. What does this language indicate about the board's regulatory approach? The correct answer is B. The conduct itself, not merely its consequences, is the subject of disciplinary concern. Rationale. The phrase regardless of actual damage means the board may discipline negligent or unacceptable conduct, even when no patient harm is demonstrated, because the quality of the conduct itself, not its consequences, is the regulatory concern. This is why board discipline can reach conduct that a civil malpractice plaintiff could not pursue. Question 9. A Mississippi physical therapist is named in a malpractice lawsuit after a patient is injured during a treatment session. For the patient to prevail, the court will require that a specific 4-part legal framework be satisfied in full. Which set correctly identifies the 4 elements that must each be established? The correct answer is D. Duty, breach, causation, and harm. Rationale. Proving physical therapy malpractice requires 4 elements. Duty means the therapist had a professional responsibility to the patient. Breach means the therapist deviated from the accepted standard of care. Causation means the breach directly caused the patient's injury. And harm means the patient suffered actual injury. If any one element is missing, the claim fails. Question 10. The course describes a patient's capacity to consent as covering 4 dimensions. Which set correctly identifies them? The correct answer is C.
understanding, appreciation, reasoning, and communication. Rationale. Capacity to consent covers 4 dimensions. Understanding is comprehending the disclosed information. Appreciation is applying that information to one's own situation. Reasoning is weighing the information logically, and communication is expressing a decision clearly. Physical therapists assess decisional capacity for care, while legal competence is a judicial determination. That completes our review of the exam questions. Thank you for your dedication to ethical and lawful physical therapy practice in Mississippi, and best wishes as you carry this knowledge into your daily work.